You know that moment when you realise you've been invisible your entire life. Mine came wrapped in Christmas paper. While my brother unwrapped the keys to a brand new car, complete with a red bow, I got a pair of wool socks. Mum smiled at me across the table and said, "Your brother needs it more. He has to impress his girlfriend." I smiled back. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, I was the one paying their mortgage every single month for 5 years. See, when Dad got sick, I refinanced their house in my name to save them from foreclosure. They thought I was just helping out. They had no idea I owned everything. So when Mom handed me those socks worth maybe $12, while my brother got $25,000 on wheels, something inside me finally broke. That night, I made a decision. A month later, my phone rang. Mum's voice was panicked. "The mortgage is overdue. Did you forget to transfer the payment?" I took a slow breath and said the words I'd been practicing. "Oh, didn't I tell you?" What happened next? Let's just say they learnt a very expensive lesson about taking people for granted. And I'm about to tell you everything. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 37 years old, and for the past 12 years, I've worked as a senior loan officer at First National Bank. I'm good at my job, excellent, actually. I help people understand mortgages, refinancing, and the fine print that can make or break a family's financial future. The irony of what I'm about to tell you won't be lost on anyone, least of all me. Christmas morning started the way it always did in my family, with me doing everything while everyone else waited to be served. I'd been at my parents' house since 6 a.m, prepping the turkey, peeling potatoes, setting the table, with Mum's good china that only came out once a year. My father sat in his recliner watching football. My mother fluttered around critiquing my seasoning choices, but not actually helping. By noon, I was sweating over a hot stove in my nicest dress, while they sipped eggnog in the living room. At 1:15, my brother Brian finally arrived. I heard his voice before I saw him, loud, confident, filled with that easy charm he'd always had. "Merry Christmas, everyone!" He swept into the kitchen with his girlfriend Jessica on his arm, both of them looking like they'd just stepped out of a catalogue. Jessica's smile was perfect. Brian's cologne was expensive. Neither of them apologised for being over an hour late. "Sarah, you remember Jessica?" Brian said, barely glancing at me as I pulled the turkey from the oven. "Of course," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "It's good to see you again." Jessica's eyes drifted to my flushed face, my slightly wilted hair, the gravy stain on my apron. "You too," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. We sat down to eat at 2:00. I'd done all the cooking, but somehow Brian got all the compliments. "This stuffing is amazing," Dad said. Brian grinned as if he'd made it himself. I said nothing. I'd learned years ago that pointing out my contributions only made me look petty. After dinner came the gift exchange. We gathered in the living room, and Mum handed out presents with the ceremony of a queen distributing favours. Brian went first, as he always did. Mum and Dad had pooled their resources this year for something special, they said. Brian tore open the oversized envelope and pulled out a set of car keys attached to a leather keychain. "No way!" he breathed, jumping to his feet. "Are you serious? I was sorry." Dad was grinning. "Go look in the driveway." We all followed Brian outside, where a sleek silver sedan sat in the driveway, with an enormous red bow on the hood. It wasn't brand new, but it was only 2 years old, pristine, probably worth $25,000 at least. Brian whooped and hugged Mum, then Dad, then Jessica. Everyone was laughing and congratulating him. I stood on the porch, watching my hands shoved in my coat pockets. When we came back inside, Mum handed me a small rectangular package wrapped in discount paper. I already knew what it was from the weight and shape. I peeled back the wrapping, carefully, old habits die hard, and found exactly what I'd expected: a pair of plain wool socks, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at a discount store, maybe $12 total. "Oh," I said, holding them up. "Thank you." Mum settled back into her chair, looking pleased with herself. "I know they're not fancy, but I thought you could use them. You're always so practical." Then she glanced at Brian, who was still clutching his car keys like a lottery ticket, and added the words that would change everything. "Your brother needs it more to impress his girlfriend. You understand, right?" The room went quiet for just a moment. Jessica looked uncomfortable. Dad studied his drink. Brian didn't even seem to notice what Mum had said. He was too busy Googling the car's resale value on his phone. I felt every eye in the room drift to me, waiting for my reaction. I smiled. It wasn't hard. I'd been smiling through moments like this my entire life. "Of course, Mum," I said softly, folding the socks neatly. "I understand perfectly." Mum's shoulders relaxed, crisis averted. The conversation moved on. Brian started talking about how he'd always wanted a car like this, how it would be perfect for his job, how Jessica would love riding in it. I sat there holding my $12 socks and nodded in all the right places. But something inside me had shifted. An hour later, I said my goodbyes, carried my leftover containers to my car, and drove home through the dark streets. My phone was sitting in the cup holder, and as I stopped at a red light, it lit up with a notification. "Reminder mortgage payment due January 5th, amount $2,000. I stared at that notification for a long moment. Then, I looked down at the sock sitting on my passenger seat. $12. My lips curved into a small, cold smile. "This Christmas, I whispered to myself. I finally got the clarity I needed. I sat in my darkened living room that night, unable to sleep. The socks were still in their package on my coffee table, sitting next to my laptop. I couldn't stop staring at them. $12. That's what 37 years of being the responsible daughter was worth to my parents. $12. The mortgage reminder was still glowing on my phone screen. $2,000. Due in 10 days. I'd paid it every month for 5 years without fail, and somehow in my parents' minds that was just what I did. Like breathing, like existing, expected, unacknowledged, invisible. But it wasn't always like this was it. I tried to remember a time when things were different, when I mattered as much as Brian did. I scrolled back through my memories, like flipping through an old photo album, looking for proof that I'd once been seen. I found nothing. The pattern started early. I was 12 years old when I got my first part-time job babysitting the Henderson kids down the street every Saturday. I didn't do it because I loved children or needed spending money for toys. I did it because Mum told me we couldn't afford new school supplies that year. The budget was tight, she said. So I babysat every weekend for 3 months and bought my own notebooks, pens, and backpack with money that smelled like baby formula and stale Cheerios. Brian was 9 that year. He got everything new, a Star Wars lunchbox, light-up sneakers, a fancy calculator he didn't even need. When I asked Mum why he got new things, and I didn't, she put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Sweetie girls mature faster. You can handle it. Your brother still needs our help." I remember nodding like that made perfect sense. I was mature. I could handle it. That's what good daughters did. The pattern continued through middle school and high school. I worked after school at a grocery store, saving every paycheck for college because Mum and Dad made it clear there wasn't much money for my education. "You're so smart," Dad would say, ruffling my hair absently. "You'll figure it out." And I did. I applied for every scholarship, every grant, every work-study program I could find. I got into a decent state university with a partial scholarship and worked 3 jobs to cover the rest: campus library, weekend catering gigs, and tutoring kids in math. I was exhausted all the time. My grades were good, but not great, because I was too busy working to study as much as I should have. I missed parties, football games, and spring break trips because I couldn't afford them. I told myself it was building character. I told myself I was learning the value of hard work. Brian, meanwhile, went to college 2 years after me with full parental funding. Room and board paid, meal plan covered, spending money deposited into his account every month like clockwork. He joined a fraternity, went on ski trips, and graduated with a degree in business and zero debt. When I pointed out the disparity once during Thanksgiving break, Dad sighed and said, "Your brother needs support to build confidence. He's not as naturally gifted as you are, Sarah. We're just trying to help him find his way." Naturally gifted. That was code for, "You don't need our help." I was supposed to take it as a compliment, I think. Instead, it felt like being told I didn't deserve their investment because I'd already proven I could survive without it. After college, I moved back home for 6 months while I searched for a job in banking. I paid rent $300 a month and bought my own groceries. Brian lived at home rent-free for 3 years after graduation, while he found himself. Nobody asked him to contribute. Nobody expected him to. When I finally got my first real job and moved into my own apartment, Mum cried and said she'd miss me. But I noticed she didn't cry when Brian eventually moved out. She helped him pick furniture. She co-signed his first lease. She gave him her old couch and kitchen supplies. When I moved out, I got a hug and a reminder to call every week. The real sacrifices started 5 years ago when Dad got sick. He'd had a heart attack, not a massive one, but enough to scare everyone and pile up medical bills that insurance didn't fully cover. I was 32 and finally stable in my career. I'd just gotten promoted to senior loan officer, and my salary had increased enough that I had savings for the first time in my adult life. When Mum called crying about the bills, I didn't hesitate. I wrote a check for $15,000 and told her not to worry about paying it back. "You're such a blessing," she'd said, squeezing my hand. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Brian didn't contribute. He was between jobs at the time. Nobody asked him to help. Nobody expected him to. Then came the house repairs. The roof leaked, the water heater died, and the foundation needed work. Another $8,000 this time, spread over 2 years. I paid for most of it. Brian chipped in $500 once and got thanked profusely at Sunday dinner. I got a pat on the shoulder and a reminder that family takes care of family. The mortgage situation started 3 years ago. Dad's hours had been cut at work after his heart attack, and Mum had never worked outside the home. They were falling behind on payments and facing foreclosure. I sat with them at their kitchen table reviewing their finances with the professional expertise I'd spent years developing. The numbers were bad. Really bad. "Let me help," I'd said. "We can refinance. I'll co-sign. We can restructure the payments." What I didn't tell them, what I'm not sure they ever fully understood, was that when we refinanced, I became the primary borrower. My name went first on all the documents. My credit score carried the loan. Legally, the house became mine. They became residents with rights, but I owned the mortgage. I owned the debt. I owned the responsibility. I didn't do it to trap them or control them. I did it because I loved them, and because nobody else was going to step up. Brian certainly wasn't offering. For 5 years, I've paid $2,000 a month without fail. That's $120,000. Added to the medical bills and house repairs, I've given my parents $143,000 of my own money. I've never asked for repayment. I've never complained. I've never even mentioned it unless they brought it up, which they rarely did. And in return, I got polite nods when I told them about my promotion to senior loan officer. I got a "that's nice, dear" when I won a community service award for volunteering at a financial literacy program. I got silence when I mentioned I'd been featured in the local business magazine. Meanwhile, Brian got a celebration dinner when he kept a sales job for 6 consecutive months. He got champagne toasts when he got promoted to assistant manager at a car dealership. He got tearful pride when he bought his first house with Mum and Dad's help, on the down payment naturally. Every achievement I worked for was met with the assumption that of course I'd succeed. I was Sarah. I was capable. I was independent. I didn't need validation or celebration or even basic acknowledgement. But Brian needed encouragement. Brian needed support. Brian needed a car to impress his girlfriend. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me out of my thoughts. I picked it up and saw a text from Mum sent at 11:47 on Christmas night. "Sweetie, don't forget the mortgage transfer tomorrow. You're such a blessing to this family." I stared at those words for a long time. Such a blessing, not "thank you for everything you've done," not "we appreciate your sacrifice." Just a reminder of what was expected wrapped in a compliment that felt more like obligation than gratitude. I set the phone down carefully. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I felt perfectly calm, eerily calm. For the first time in 37 years, I wasn't going to smile and say, "Of course." For the first time in my life, I was going to see what happened when I stopped being a blessing and started being a person. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Mum's text message sat unanswered on my phone. The mortgage reminder glowed accusingly from my banking app. January 4th had turned into January 5th, somewhere around 2 a.m, and I still hadn't made the transfer. I should explain something that my parents either didn't understand or chose not to acknowledge. When I said I'd helped them 5 years ago, they heard one thing. The bank heard something entirely different. It started the way most financial disasters start, with a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was at work reviewing a loan application when Mum's number flashed across my screen. Her voice was shaking when I answered. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk to you about something. Can you come over tonight?" I went straight after work. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of him, his face grey in a way that had nothing to do with his heart condition. Mum's eyes were red. The foreclosure notice sat between them like a bomb that had already gone off. They were 4 months behind on mortgage payments. Dad's hours had been cut after his heart attack. His company claimed it was restructuring, but everyone knew they were pushing out employees who'd become expensive health insurance risks. Mum had never worked outside the home. Their savings were gone, eaten up by medical bills and everyday expenses. The bank had been patient, then firm, and now final. They had 60 days to pay everything owed or lose the house they'd lived in for 30 years. "We don't know what to do," Mum had whispered. "We've tried everything. The bank won't work with us anymore. Our credit is ruined. We're going to lose everything." I'd looked at those papers with my professional eye, doing calculations in my head that I'd done 1,000 times for strangers. The numbers were bad, but not impossible. The house had equity. They had income, just not enough. What they needed was a complete refinance with better terms and a co-signer with excellent credit and stable income. What they needed was me. "Let me talk to some people at my bank," I'd said. "Maybe we can figure something out." I spent the next 3 weeks working on their case like it was the most important loan application of my career. I pulled every string I had. I called in favours from underwriters who owed me. I restructured the entire loan to get them the lowest possible interest rate and stretched the payments over 30 years to make them affordable. But there was one non-negotiable requirement, that the bank wouldn't budge on. They needed a primary borrower with provable stable income and excellent credit. Dad didn't qualify. Mum had no income history. The only way to make the loan work was for me to sign as the primary borrower. "What does that mean exactly?" Dad had asked when I explained it to them. I'd been careful with my words. "It means my name goes on the loan as the main responsible party. You'll still live here. Nothing changes for you day to day. I'll just be the one making sure the payments get made." What I didn't spell out, what I'm not entirely sure they understood even now, was that when you refinance a property with a new primary borrower, ownership transfers. Legally, the house became mine. They became residents with legal protections, yes, but the deed was in my name. The mortgage was my responsibility. The asset was my asset. I didn't hide this from them exactly. All the paperwork was there for them to read. But when you're drowning and someone throws you a life preserver, you don't stop to read the fine print on the rope. You just grab it and hold on. The bank approved the refinance. My parents kept their home. Crisis averted. "We'll pay you back," Dad had promised, shaking my hand like we'd made a business deal. "Every penny, as soon as we get back on our feet." I'd smiled and said what I always said, "Don't worry about it, we're family." That was 5 years ago. They never got back on their feet, not really. Dad's hours never increased. Mum never went back to work. The promise to pay me back faded from a concrete plan to a vague intention to an unspoken understanding that Sarah would just handle it. Because that's what Sarah did. The monthly ritual became as predictable as breathing. On the 5th of every month, I'd log into my bank account, transfer $2,000 to the mortgage company, and file away the confirmation email. It took less than 5 minutes. It was so routine that I could do it from my phone while waiting in line at the grocery store or sitting in my car during lunch break. I never missed a payment. Not once in 60 months. That's $120,000 transferred in perfect clockwork precision, each transaction as invisible to my parents as I'd always been. Sometimes Mum would text a reminder like tonight. Sometimes she'd call on the 6th or 7th. If she hadn't seen the confirmation email, her voice tight with anxiety, until I assured her it was done. But she never called on the 4th to say thank you in advance. She never sent flowers on the 5th to acknowledge another month of my salary, keeping their roof over their heads. The gratitude, when it came at all, was always wrapped in relief that I'd done what was expected. Now it was January 4th turning into January 5th, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my finger hovering over the transfer button like it was a detonator. I thought about Brian's car with its red bow. I thought about Mum's words, "Your brother needs it more." I thought about those $12 socks sitting on my coffee table. I thought about 37 years of being the capable one, the independent one, the one who could handle it. I thought about what would happen if I just closed the laptop without clicking. The bank would send a late notice after 15 days. My parents would receive it around January 20th. They'd panic. They'd call me. They'd assume it was a mistake, a technical glitch, an oversight, because Sarah didn't forget things. Sarah didn't make mistakes. Sarah was reliable. Except this wouldn't be a mistake. This would be a choice. My hand moved to the laptop lid, not to the transfer button, to the lid. I closed it with a soft click. The screen went dark. My banking app disappeared. The transfer screen vanished. The routine that I'd performed 60 times without fail simply didn't happen. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, waiting to feel guilty or scared or panicked. But I felt none of those things. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, powerful. For the first time in my adult life, I held all the cards. I owned the house they lived in. I controlled the payments that kept them there. I had the leverage that came with being the person everyone took for granted. And they had no idea. I picked up my phone and looked at Mum's text again. "Don't forget the mortgage transfer tomorrow. You're such a blessing to this family." I didn't respond. I simply turned off my phone and went to bed. As I lay in the darkness, staring at my ceiling, I whispered into the quiet of my bedroom. Let's see how long it takes them to notice when I'm not there to catch them. For the first time in 60 months, January 5th would come and go without a mortgage payment. And for the first time in 37 years, Sarah Mitchell was going to let someone else figure out what to do about it. I fell asleep smiling. I woke up on January 5th, feeling strangely peaceful. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, and for the first moment in recent memory, I didn't reach for my phone to check my banking app. I didn't verify that a transfer had gone through. I didn't send my usual confirmation email to my parents. I simply got up, made coffee, and got ready for work, like it was any ordinary Friday. My phone had 12 missed calls by the time I turned it back on at lunchtime. 9 from Mum, 3 from Dad, No calls from Brian, I noticed. Of course not. The mortgage wasn't his problem. It had never been his problem. I listened to the voicemails while eating a salad at my desk. The progression was almost predictable in its escalation. Message 1 sent at 9:03 that morning was light and breezy. "Hi, sweetie, just checking in. I didn't get the usual confirmation email about the mortgage. Did everything go through okay? Call me when you get a chance." Message 2-3 hours later had an edge of concern. "Sarah, honey, I'm still waiting to hear from you. The bank hasn't confirmed receipt of the payment yet. Can you give me a call? I'm starting to worry." By message 5 received at 2 in the afternoon. Mum's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Sarah, please call me back. I've checked the bank account 3 times and there's no record of the transfer. Did something happen? Are you okay? I need to hear from you." I deleted each message after listening to it. I didn't call back. I simply finished my salad, threw away the container, and went back to work reviewing a loan application for a young couple buying their first home. The irony wasn't lost on me. Saturday morning brought more calls. I was at the grocery store pushing my cart through the produce section when my phone started buzzing in my purse. I pulled it out, saw Mum's name and sent it to voicemail. Then I picked out avocados and moved on to the dairy aisle. My phone buzzed again. Voicemail again. I bought Greek yogurt and artisan bread and drove home without listening to a single message. That afternoon, Dad called for the first time. His voicemail was shorter, gruffer. "Sarah, it's your father. Your mother is very upset. We need to talk about the mortgage situation. Please call us back today." There was something in his tone, not anger exactly, but a kind of bewildered frustration that I deviated from the script we'd all been following for 5 years. I didn't call back. Sunday was the hardest day. I went to my usual yoga class in the morning, came home, and tried to read a book I'd been meaning to finish for months. But I couldn't concentrate. My phone sat on the coffee table silent now. The calls had stopped coming, which somehow felt worse than when they had been constant. The silence meant they were regrouping, strategizing, possibly starting to understand that something had fundamentally shifted. I picked up my phone a dozen times, my finger hovering over Mum's contact. I'd start to compose a text. "Sorry, there was a problem with my bank account, or I'll take care of it tomorrow." And then I'd set the phone down and force myself to walk away. By Sunday night, the guilt was eating at me. I couldn't sit still. I paced my apartment, made tea. I didn't drink, turned on the television, and turned it off again. Finally, around 10 o'clock, I went to my hall closet and pulled down a plastic storage bin I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old photo albums, the kind with sticky pages and plastic covers that nobody made anymore. I carried the bin to my couch and started flipping through the albums, not entirely sure what I was looking for. Maybe proof that I was wrong. Maybe evidence that my family had valued me once, that this favoritism I'd experienced was all in my head, a distortion born of sibling rivalry and adult resentment. But the photos told their own story. Christmas morning, 1993. Brian, age 7, front and centre, unwrapping presents, while I sat in the background, barely visible behind the tree. My 8th grade graduation. Brian goofing off in the foreground while I stood awkwardly in my cap and gown, halfway out of frame. Family vacation at the beach. Brian building sandcastles with Dad while Mum took pictures, and me, somewhere in the distance, a blur in a swimsuit collecting shells alone. High school prom, a single photo of me in my dress clearly taken as an afterthought, while an entire album page was dedicated to Brian's junior prom 2 years later. Every major milestone, every holiday, every family gathering followed the same pattern. Brian in the centre, in focus, surrounded by attention. Me in the margins, in the background, present but not quite seen. I turned another page and stopped. It was a picture from my college graduation. I was standing in my cap and gown between Mum and Dad, holding my diploma. I'd graduated summa cum laude after working 3 jobs for 4 years. But in the photo, Mum was looking at her watch. Dad's attention was somewhere off camera. And there, in the background, was my grandmother, Grandma Ruth. She'd been gone for 8 years now, but looking at her face in that photo brought back a flood of memories. She was the only one who'd been looking at me, really looking with pride shining in her eyes. She was the only one who'd seemed to understand what that diploma had cost me. I remembered what happened after that photo was taken. We'd gone to dinner at a nice restaurant, my choice as the graduate. But halfway through the meal, Brian had called with some crisis at his fraternity house, and the entire dinner conversation had pivoted to discussing his problems. Grandma had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Later, when we were alone, she'd pulled me aside. "Sarah, my girl," she'd said, her voice quiet but firm. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of taking you for granted, not to punish them, but because it's the only way they'll ever learn to see you." I'd nodded like I understood, but I don't think I really did. Not then. I was 22 and still convinced that if I just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, proved myself enough, my parents would eventually notice, eventually appreciate, eventually see me the way Grandma did. 8 years later, sitting on my couch at 37 years old, staring at Grandma's face in that photograph, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. She'd watched this pattern her whole life. She'd seen me disappear into the background of my own family, and she'd known even then that nothing would change unless I forced it to change. "You were right, Grandma," I whispered to the photograph. "You were always right." I closed the album and was about to put it back in the bin when something fell out from between the pages. A small envelope yellowed with age with my name written on it in Grandma's shaky handwriting. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly, and carefully opened it. Inside was a short letter dated just a few months before she died. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you finally reached your limit. Good. Don't let them make you feel guilty for having boundaries. Don't let them convince you that your needs matter less than everyone else's. You are not selfish for wanting to be seen. You are not cruel for demanding to be valued. Stand firm, my girl. I'm proud of you." I read it 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my wallet, right next to my bank card. A reminder, a permission slip, a blessing from the only person who'd ever truly seen me. Monday morning I went to work. Tuesday, I had coffee with my co-workers and laughed at someone's story about their disastrous online dating experience. Wednesday, I stayed late to help a young woman understand her refinancing options and felt genuinely good about making a difference in someone's financial future. My phone stayed mostly quiet. 1 or 2 texts from Mum, increasingly terse. "We need to talk." "This isn't funny. Call me." I didn't respond to any of them. For the first time in years, I felt light, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight, and now that weight was gone. I wasn't happy, exactly, there was too much uncertainty for that. But I was free in a way I'd never been before. On Saturday afternoon, 6 days after I'd decided not to make the mortgage payment, I was cleaning my apartment when I noticed the Christmas gift bag still sitting on my counter where I'd left it. The socks were still inside, still in their package. I picked up the bag, intending to throw the whole thing away, when I felt something I'd missed before. Something at the bottom of the bag underneath the tissue paper. I pulled it out the socks and the crumpled tissue paper, and there, stuck to the bottom of the bag, was a folded piece of yellowed paper that looked like it had been there for a very long time. My heart started beating faster as I carefully peeled it free and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. It was my mother's writing, but from decades ago when her hand was steadier and her letters were rounder. I sat down on my kitchen floor, right there in the middle of my Saturday cleaning, and began to read. The paper was fragile, threatening to tear along the creases, where it had been folded for what looked like decades. The ink had faded to a soft brown, and the handwriting, though unmistakably my mother's, was younger, somehow rounder, and less controlled than the tight, anxious script I'd grown up seeing on grocery lists and birthday cards. "To Sarah," it began, and my breath caught because this note had been written for me before I'd even understood I needed it. "These are the socks Grandma made for me when I felt invisible to my own mother. I kept them for you. I'm sorry I forgot how it feels. Your mother, 1995. I read it 3 times before the words fully penetrated. 1995. I would have been 7 years old. Brian would have been 2. This note had been sitting in a drawer or a box somewhere for 28 years waiting, and somehow, whether through intention or cosmic irony, it had ended up in the bottom of a gift bag with those same socks on the Christmas that finally broke me. Grandma made these socks for Mum, my grandmother, Grandma Ruth, who'd squeezed my hand at my college graduation and told me that letting people face consequences was sometimes the kindest thing, had made these socks for her own daughter when Mum felt invisible. I stood up from the kitchen floor, still holding the note, and walked to my living room where the photo albums were still scattered across my coffee table. I flipped through them with new eyes, looking not at myself in the margins, but at my mother. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop seeing it. There was Mum, at her own high school graduation, standing slightly apart from her family, while her brother, my Uncle Tom, was surrounded by relatives congratulating him. Mum, at her wedding, where the photographer had clearly been told to focus on the groom's family because they were more photogenic. Mum holding newborn me while Grandma cooed over Tom's son born the same month. Mum serving Thanksgiving dinner while everyone else ate her plate. Still empty an hour into the meal because she was too busy making sure everyone else had seconds. The pattern had been there all along. I just never thought to look for it. Grandma Ruth, the woman I'd idolized, the woman who'd been my only ally, had done to my mother exactly what my mother had done to me. She'd had a favourite child, and it wasn't Mum. Uncle Tom was the golden boy, the one who got attention and praise and second chances. Mum was the responsible one, the capable one, the one who could handle it. I sank onto my couch, the note still in my hand, and felt something fundamental shift in my chest. All my life, I'd believed my mother's favouritism toward Brian was personal, that she looked at me and Brian and consciously chose him, that there was something inherently more lovable about him, something inherently less worthy about me. I'd carried that belief like a stone in my pocket, getting heavier year by year until it weighed enough to drown me. But this note changed everything. Mum hadn't chosen to hurt me. She'd simply recreated the only family dynamic she knew. She'd been the invisible daughter, and instead of breaking that cycle, she'd unconsciously rebuilt it with her own children. She'd overcompensated with Brian, the way Grandma had probably overcompensated with Tom. And I had become her. The understanding didn't erase 37 years of pain. It didn't retroactively fill the empty spaces where validation should have been, or heal the wounds of 1,000 small rejections. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't undo the hurt, but it does something else. It removes the personal blame. It stops you from believing that you were somehow insufficient, somehow less deserving of love. My mother hadn't failed to see me because I wasn't worth seeing. She'd failed to see me because she'd never been properly seen herself, and no one had taught her how to look. I thought about that Christmas dinner, about Mum handing me $12 socks while Brian got a car. I thought about her saying, "Your brother needs it more," with such casual certainty, as if my needs were so obvious they didn't require consideration. I thought about Grandma probably saying something similar to Mum once upon a time. "Your brother needs it more, dear. You're so capable, you understand." The generational echo was almost unbearable. I held the note against my chest and let myself cry for the first time since Christmas. Not angry tears or frustrated tears, but deep, grieving tears for my mother and myself, and every woman who'd been taught that being capable meant being invisible. Every daughter who'd learned that needing less meant being worth less. My phone rang, cutting through my thoughts. I picked it up and saw Mum's name for what felt like the 100th time that week. But this time felt different. This time I knew something she didn't know I knew. I knew she'd once been me. I knew she'd felt what I felt. I knew she'd written this note in a moment of clarity, and then somehow lost sight of it again, buried it in old gift wrap, and forgotten her own pain deeply enough to inflict it on someone else. The phone kept ringing. I looked at the note in my hand at Grandma's photo album, still open on my coffee table, at the socks sitting in their package on my counter. Everything I thought I knew about my family had reorganized itself in the past 10 minutes. The story hadn't changed, but the angle had. Mum wasn't a villain. She was a victim who'd become a perpetrator without ever meaning to. And I was standing at a crossroads where I could either continue the cycle or break it. But breaking cycles, I was learning, required more than just understanding. It required action. It required consequences. It required letting the people who'd hurt you feel the impact of that hurt instead of cushioning them from it the way I'd always done. The phone stopped ringing and immediately started again. I picked it up. Mum's name. Her 7th call today, according to my phone log. I thought about letting it go to voicemail, like all the others, but something about holding that note, about seeing my mother's younger handwriting promising to remember what it felt like to be invisible, and then watching her forget anyway, made me realize that silence alone wouldn't break this cycle. I needed to speak. I needed to be heard. I needed to tell the truth, even if it hurt. My finger hovered over the answer button. I could hear Grandma's voice in my head. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of taking you for granted. But I could also hear something else now, something I hadn't understood before. Grandma hadn't just been talking about them. She'd been talking about me too, about my own need to stop protecting people from the truth of their actions. The phone rang again. I took a deep breath. I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the bank notice Mum was about to mention, about the 30 days overdue, about the panic in her voice when she realised that, for the first time in 5 years, I hadn't caught them when they fell. I held the note against my chest one more time, feeling the weight of 3 generations of invisible daughters. "So you became what hurt you most, Mum," I whispered. "And now I have to break the cycle." I pressed the answer button. "Hello, Mother." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a silence so heavy I could feel it pressing through the phone. When Mum finally spoke, her voice was shaking, stripped of the casual entitlement that usually coloured our conversations about money. "Sarah, oh, thank God, I've been trying to reach you all week." She paused and I could hear her struggling to find the right words, the right tone. "The bank sent a notice. It came today. They said we're 30 days overdue on the mortgage. They said if we don't pay within 15 days, they're going to start foreclosure proceedings." I closed my eyes and saw that note in my mind. "I'm sorry, I forgot how it feels." "I know," I said quietly. Another silence, longer this time. "You know, what do you mean? You know Sarah did something happen to the payment. Was there a problem with your account?" "No, Mum, there was no problem with my account." "Then, I don't understand. Why didn't you transfer the money?" I opened my eyes and looked at the socks on my counter, at the note in my hand, at my reflection in the darkening window. 37 years old and finally ready to be seen. "Because," I said, my voice steady despite the tears on my face, "I decided not to." The silence that followed my words stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Mum's voice came back higher and thinner than before. "You decided not to, Sarah. What does that mean? You can't just decide not to pay the mortgage. This is our home. We could lose everything." I walked to my window and looked out at the street below, watching a neighbour walk their dog in the fading afternoon light. Everything looked so normal, so ordinary. Meanwhile, my entire family structure was collapsing over a phone line. I'm taking a break this month, I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. You know to save up. Maybe next Christmas I can afford something more than socks. The gasp on the other end was sharp enough to cut. This is about the Christmas gifts. Sarah, are you serious right now? You're willing to let us lose our house because you're upset about a pair of socks? No, Mom, I am willing to let you face the reality of what happens when I'm not there to catch you. The socks are just what finally made me see clearly. See what? Clearly? That you're cruel, that you're vindictive, Sarah. I never thought you could be this petty. The accusation should have stung. A week ago, it would have sent me scrambling to apologise and explain. But I spent 7 days sitting with my decision, and I'd found Grandma's letter telling me not to let them make me feel guilty for having boundaries. I'd found Mum's own note admitting she knew what it felt like to be invisible. The guilt they were trying to weaponise had lost its power. Petty would be giving Brian $12 socks and you a $25,000 car, I said quietly. What I'm doing is called setting a boundary. A boundary? Sarah, this isn't a boundary, this is abandonment. We're your parents, we raised you, clothed you, fed you, and I paid you back. I interrupted, my voice still calm but with steel underneath. $15,000 for Dad's medical bills, $8,000 for house repairs, $120,000 for the mortgage over 5 years. That's $143,000, Mum. I've more than repaid any debt I might have owed for the 18 years you were legally required to raise me. Another silence. I could hear her breathing rapid and shallow. That's not how family works, she finally whispered. Family helps each other. Family doesn't keep score. You're right, I agreed. Family shouldn't keep score. But family also shouldn't take one person for granted while celebrating another. Family shouldn't expect one child to sacrifice everything while giving the other everything. And yet, here we are. So what about Brian? Mom's voice had shifted now, taking on a defensive edge. You want to punish him too? Punish your father? We could all end up on the street because you're having a tantrum about favoritism. Lose the house. I let the question hang in the air for a moment. But I thought Brian needs things more than I do. Maybe his new car can help. Maybe he can take out a loan against it. Or maybe he can get a second job like I did when I was 12 years old buying my own school supplies. There are options, Mum. You've just never had to consider them because I've always been there. You're being cruel, Sarah. This isn't like you. No, I said softly. What isn't like me is saying no. What isn't like me is having needs that matter as much as everyone else's. But I'm learning. I heard muffled voices in the background, Dad's low rumble, then Brian's sharper tone. They were all there together, probably gathered around the kitchen table for an emergency family meeting that didn't include me. The irony was almost funny. Your father wants to talk to you, Mum said, her voice tight. I'm sure he does, but I'm done for today. Tell Dad I'll call him back when I'm ready. Sarah. I hung up. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear or guilt. From adrenaline. From the sheer unfamiliarity of standing my ground. My phone buzzed immediately with a text from Dad. Family dinner. Tonight, 6 p.m. Non-negotiable. I stared at that word non-negotiable. How many times had I received commands disguised as invitations? How many family dinners had I attended because they were expected, important, non-negotiable? And how many times had Brian skipped them with barely a comment while I rearranged my life to show up? I typed back slowly, deliberately. I'll think about it. 3 dots appeared, immediately disappeared, appeared again. Then, this is serious, we need to talk. Tonight. I didn't respond. I set my phone down and made myself dinner pasta with vegetables, nothing fancy. I ate slowly, tasting each bite, and thought about whether I wanted to go to this dinner. Not whether I should go or whether I was obligated to go, but whether I wanted to. The truth was, I did want to go. Not out of guilt or duty or fear, out of curiosity. I'd spent 37 years watching my family operate with me as the invisible support system. I wanted to see what happened when that support system suddenly had a voice and used it. I wanted to see their faces when they realised I wasn't going to apologise or back down. I wanted to witness the moment when my absence from my assigned role became impossible to ignore. At 5:45, I got in my car and drove to my parents' house. The route was so familiar, I could have driven it blind every turn, every stop sign, every landmark etched into my muscle memory from decades of dutiful visits. But tonight, everything looked different, sharper, more real. I pulled into the driveway at 6:03, late enough to make a point not so late that it would derail the conversation. Brian's silver sedan was parked prominently in front of the garage, gleaming under the porch light. Of course he was here. Of course they'd called in reinforcements. I sat in my car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the house I legally owned but had never felt belonged to me. Every window was lit. Through the front window, I could see all three of them sitting at the dining room table. Not in the kitchen, where we usually gathered, but the formal dining room. This was meant to be serious, official, intimidating. Mum's face was blotchy and red, her eyes puffy from crying. Dad sat rigid in his chair, jaw clenched in that way that meant he was trying to control his anger. And Brian looked furious. His arms crossed his whole body, radiating indignation. They were waiting for me to come in and apologise and fix everything like I always did, waiting for the old Sarah, the capable Sarah, the Sarah who could handle it. I grabbed my purse and the envelope I'd brought with me, copies of bank statements, mortgage documents, a complete financial record of every dollar I'd given this family over the past decade. I'd printed them out this afternoon, neat and organised, because if we were going to have this conversation, it was going to be based on facts, not feelings or selective memory. I took a deep breath. Through the window, I saw Dad check his watch. Mum dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Brian said something that made Dad's jaw clench tighter. "Here we go," I whispered to myself. I got out of the car, walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. I didn't use my key. I didn't just walk in like I'd done 1,000 times before. This wasn't my home in any way that mattered beyond a legal document. If they wanted to treat this like a formal meeting, I would respect that boundary. Dad answered the door, his face a mask of controlled anger. "You're late." "Traffic," I said simply, which was a lie, but it didn't matter. He stood aside to let me in, and I walked past him into the dining room where Mum and Brian waited. The table was bare except for the foreclosure notice sitting in the centre like an accusation. No food, no coffee, no pretense of hospitality. Just the notice and 3 pairs of eyes locked on me. I sat down in the chair farthest from all of them, set my purse on the floor and placed my envelope of documents on the table. Then I folded my hands and waited. "Well," Brian said, breaking the silence first, "are you going to explain what the hell you're doing?" I looked at him, my younger brother, my parents' golden child, the person I'd resented and envied and despite everything still loved. He looked genuinely confused, as if my behaviour was so far outside the realm of possibility that he couldn't even begin to comprehend it. "I'm doing exactly what I said on the phone," I replied calmly. "I'm taking a break from paying your mortgage." "It's not our mortgage, Sarah," Dad said, his voice tight. "It's the family home. You're home too." "Actually," I said, sliding the envelope toward the centre of the table. "Legally speaking, it's my mortgage. My name is the primary borrower, my credit, my responsibility, and therefore my decision." Mum made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Brian leaned forward, his face flushing. "You can't be serious." I met his eyes steadily. "I've never been more serious in my life." Brian's chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as he stood up, his face darkening from pink to red. "You can't be serious," he repeated louder this time, as if volume could change my answer. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I didn't flinch. I'd imagined this moment 100 times over the past week, played out every possible reaction, steeled myself for anger and accusations. But now that it was actually happening, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching a play I'd already seen and knew how it ended. There's nothing wrong with me, Brian. That's actually the point. Nothing wrong. He laughed a sharp, bitter sound. You're putting Mum and Dad on the street because you're having a tantrum over a pair of socks. That's insane, Sarah. That's cruel and petty and insane. I'm not putting anyone on the street over socks, I said, my voice remaining level. I'm stopping enabling after 37 years of being invisible in my own family. Mum's hand flew to her mouth. Invisible, Sarah, how can you say that? We love you. We've always loved you. I turned to her, and for a moment I saw the young woman who'd written that note in 1995, the woman who knew what it felt like to be the forgotten daughter. But that flash of recognition was buried under decades of denial. Love isn't just a feeling, Mum. It's action. It's attention. It's making someone feel like they matter as much as everyone else. I gestured to Brian. He got a car worth $25,000. I got $12 socks. And when I pointed out the disparity, you told me he needs it more. That's not love distributed equally. That's favoritism so blatant you didn't even try to hide it. It was one Christmas, Dad interjected, his voice gruff. You're destroying this family over one Christmas gift. No, Dad. I'm responding to one Christmas gift that perfectly represented a lifetime of being treated like my needs don't matter. But if you want to talk about more than Christmas, we can do that. I pulled out my phone and opened the spreadsheet I'd made 2 nights ago when I couldn't sleep. I'd spent hours documenting every financial transaction, every instance of help given, every dollar spent. The numbers had been cathartic to organise, turning years of vague resentment into concrete data. $143,000, I said, turning the phone screen toward them. That's what I've given this family over the past 10 years. $15,000 for medical bills, $8,000 for house repairs, $120,000 for mortgage payments, all documented, all verifiable. I slid the phone across the table toward Brian. How much have you contributed to this family financially in that same time period? The silence was profound. Brian stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Dad looked away, studying the wall with sudden, intense interest. Mom's tissue was shredded in her hands. That's not fair, Brian finally said. I've been struggling. I've had student loans, rent car payments. So have I interrupted. The difference is I've had all of those things plus your family's survival on my shoulders. You've had the luxury of putting yourself first because you knew I'd take care of everyone else. We never asked you to pay all that, Mum said weakly. You offered. You wanted to help. Did I offer, or did you call crying about foreclosure and medical bills and disasters, and I responded the way I'd been trained to respond since I was 12 years old? There's a difference between offering and being the only person who shows up. Brian slammed his hand on the table, making all of us jump. This is bullshit. You're trying to make yourself look like some kind of martyr, but the truth is you're just bitter. You've always been bitter that I'm the fun one, the social one, the one people actually like. Brian, stop, Dad said quietly. But Brian was on a roll now, years of unexamined entitlement spilling out. No, she needs to hear this. You think you're so superior because you're responsible and boring and never need anything from anyone. But you know what, Sarah? That's your choice. Nobody forced you to be the family ATM. You could have said no at any time, but you didn't because you liked feeling important. You liked being needed. And now you're mad because we actually did need you. And you finally realised you can't guilt trip us into treating you like a hero for doing what family is supposed to do. The words should have hurt. Maybe a week ago they would have devastated me. But I'd spent 7 days reading Grandma's letter, studying Mum's old note, understanding the cycles of pain that had created this dynamic. Brian's anger wasn't really about me. It was about the terror of losing his safety net, the person who'd always been there to catch him when he fell. "You're right," I said softly, and Brian blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. I did like feeling needed. I did like feeling important, because it was the only way I felt visible in this family. But I've learnt something recently. Being needed isn't the same as being valued, and I'm done accepting one as a substitute for the other. Dad cleared his throat. "Sarah, I think you need to take some time to calm down and think about what you're really doing here. This is permanent damage you're causing over temporary emotions." "Temporary emotions," I repeated. "Dad, I've felt this way my entire life. I just never said it out loud because I was too afraid of losing the scraps of belonging I did have." "So what do you want?" Mum asked, her voice rising. "An apology." "Fine. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. Is that what you need to hear? Now will you fix this?" I looked at her tired face, her red-rimmed eyes, and felt a pang of something that might have been pity. She genuinely didn't understand. She'd lived this dynamic for so long that she couldn't see it anymore. She'd become her own mother without realizing it, and now she was watching her daughter become her. "An apology isn't enough, Mum. An apology without changed behaviour is just words. I need you to understand what you've done, not just say sorry to make me transfer money." Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping back. His face had gone from controlled anger to cold fury. "I've had enough. Sarah, if you don't transfer that mortgage payment by Monday morning, you're no longer part of this family. Do you understand me? You're out. Holidays, birthdays, everything. We're done." The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. This was the moment where the old Sarah would have crumbled, would have apologised, would have promised to be better and do better and think better. The old Sarah would have been terrified of exile from the only family she had. But the old Sarah had received $12 socks and finally understood she'd never really been in this family anyway, not in any way that counted. I stood up slowly, picked up my purse and put on my coat. My hands were steady, my voice was calm. "Dad, I stopped being part of this family the day you taught Brian his needs matter more than mine. I just didn't realise it until recently. So thank you for making official what's been true for decades." I walked toward the front door. Behind me, I heard Mum start to cry, heard Dad curse under his breath. But I kept walking, my hand on the doorknob, almost free. Then I felt Brian's hand clamp down on my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. "You're not just walking out of here. You don't get to blow up our lives and leave." I stopped, looked down at his hand on my arm, his fingers wrapped tight around my bicep. Then I looked up at his face, saw the fury and fear and wounded entitlement swirling in his eyes. "Let go. Not until you promise to fix this," he said, his grip tightening. "You're going to march right back in there and apologise to Mum and Dad and commit to making that payment. Brian, let go of me right now. Or what you'll call the police on your own brother. Jesus, Sarah, what happened to you?" I met his eyes steadily. I stopped accepting scraps and started demanding respect. "Now let go of my arm before you add assault to the list of ways this family has hurt me." For a moment, I thought he wouldn't release me. His hand tightened even more and I felt a surge of real fear. But then Dad's voice cut through. "Brian, let her go." Brian's hand dropped. I rubbed my arm where his fingers had been already feeling the bruise forming. Without another word, I opened the door and walked out into the cold night air. I got into my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway with shaking hands. Not from fear exactly, but from adrenaline, from the sheer weight of what had just happened. I'd done it. I'd stood my ground. I'd walked away. As I drove through the familiar streets toward my apartment, I checked my rearview mirror out of habit. My stomach dropped. Brian's silver sedan was behind me, following at a distance, but definitely following. He'd left right after me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself he was probably just going home, that his route happened to overlap with mine. But as I made 3 consecutive turns that weren't on any logical path to his house, he stayed behind me, following, deliberately following. I pulled into my apartment complex. my heart pounding now, and parked in my assigned spot near the building entrance where there were lights and security cameras. Brian pulled in behind me, parking his car to block mine. I grabbed my phone and my keys, holding them like weapons. Before I could decide whether to run for my apartment or sit locked in my car, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You just made a big mistake." I looked up. Through my windshield, I could see Brian sitting in his car, his phone glowing in his hand, his face illuminated by the screen. He was staring right at me. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "You have no idea what you've started." I sat frozen in my car, staring at Brian's silhouette through two windshields. My finger hovered over the 9 on my phone's keypad, ready to call for help. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the last remnant of family loyalty. Maybe it was the understanding I'd gained from Mom's note about cycles of pain. Or maybe it was just exhaustion from a night that had already drained every emotional reserve I had. I took a breath and sent a text back to the unknown number, knowing he'd see it immediately. "Go home, Brian. This doesn't help anyone." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then his car door opened. My heart hammered as he got out, but instead of approaching my car, he just stood there in the parking lot, lights looking smaller and more lost than threatening. After a long moment, he got back in his car, backed out, and drove away. I sat there for another 10 minutes, making sure he was really gone before I went inside. That was a week ago. I thought that confrontation was the worst it would get. I was wrong. I'd worked late on a Thursday evening, staying at the office to avoid going home to an empty apartment where I'd just obsess over the silence from my family. No calls, no texts. True to Dad's threat, they'd cut me off completely. Part of me was relieved. Part of me felt like I was mourning a death. When I pulled into my parking spot at 8:30 that night, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The door to my apartment building's main entrance was propped open with a brick, a violation of building policy that management was usually strict about. I felt uneasy as I climbed the stairs to my 3rd floor unit, my keys already in my hand. My apartment door was ajar. Not wide open, but cracked an inch, like someone had closed it without ensuring the latch caught. I stood in the hallway, every instinct screaming at me not to go inside. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address to the dispatcher, asking for police to check for an intruder. They arrived within 6 minutes. 2 officers, one older with greying temples, one younger who couldn't have been more than 25. The older one had me wait in the hallway while they cleared the apartment. When he came back out, his face was grim. "Whoever was here is gone now, Mum. But you should come see this." I stepped into my apartment and felt the breath leave my body. My living room looked like a tornado had torn through it. My laptop was on the floor screen, shattered keyboard bent at an unnatural angle. Picture frames were smashed, photos torn and scattered. My bookshelf had been swept clean, books lying in broken, spined heaps. The potted plants I'd carefully tended were knocked over, soil spilled across the carpet like dark blood. But the worst part was the wall. Spray painted in large, angry red letters across my cream-coloured wall were 2 words, "Family Traitor." The younger officer was taking photos. The older one was watching my face. "Any idea who might have done this, ma'am?" I stared at those words, at the dripping red paint, at the rage they represented. I thought about Brian following me home, about the threatening texts, about his hand on my arm, refusing to let me leave, about the look in his eyes when he realised I wasn't going to back down. "My brother," I said quietly. The officer's expression shifted in a way I'd seen before, that particular look that appeared when people realised a crime wasn't random, but personal, familial, complicated. "I see," he said carefully. "Family disputes they're difficult situations. Has there been ongoing conflict?" I almost laughed at the understatement. "Yes, there's been conflict. Any previous violence, threats, I showed him the texts from the unknown number. I told him about Brian following me home, blocking my car. I rolled up my sleeve to show the bruise on my arm from where he'd grabbed me, still visible after a weak purple, fading to yellow at the edges. The officer took notes, his face impassive. "Ma'am, I'm going to be honest with you. Property damage like this, when it's family, is hard to prosecute. Even with evidence, district attorneys often decline to pursue charges because families tend to reconcile and drop complaints. But given the escalation pattern you're describing, I'd strongly recommend getting a restraining order." "Will that stop him?" The officer's pause told me everything. "It's a legal boundary. Some people respect it, some don't, but it gives you documentation and legal recourse if he violates it. Without it, you have very little protection." After they left, after I'd filed the report and cleaned up the soil and swept up the broken glass, I sat on my couch, one of the few things not destroyed, and tried to process what had happened. Brian had been in my home, had touched my things, had smashed and torn and spray-painted his rage across my walls, and my parents had raised him to believe this was acceptable, that his feelings, his needs, his anger mattered more than anyone else's safety or peace or property. I needed leverage. I needed something more than my word against his, more than a police report that might never lead to charges. I needed to understand this family deeply enough to protect myself from it. Which is why 2 days later, I went back to my parents' house. I knew they'd be out. Saturdays at 2:00, they always went grocery shopping together, a routine as fixed as the mortgage payments I used to make. I still had my key, though I suspected they'd change the locks eventually. For now, it turned in the lock smoothly. The house was silent. I stood in the entryway, breathing in the familiar smell of my childhood home coffee and old furniture and Mom's lavender air freshener, and felt like a stranger. This house that was legally mine felt less like home than the violated apartment I'd just left. I went straight to Dad's office, a small room off the living room where he kept important papers in a filing cabinet that had never been locked. I found the mortgage documents easily enough, the refinance papers, with my signature, the payment history proof of everything I'd told them at that dinner. I photographed each page with my phone, but I wanted the original mortgage too, the one from before the refinance. I wanted to see what they'd been paying before I'd taken over. I dug deeper into the filing cabinet, pulling out folders of tax returns and insurance policies and utility bills. At the bottom of the drawer, something caught. The drawer wouldn't open all the way. I pulled harder, heard a crack, and the false bottom of the drawer came loose. Underneath was a manila envelope, unmarked, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. My hand shook as I pulled it out. Whatever was in here, Dad had hidden it deliberately. Had never meant for anyone to find it. I opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a sheaf of papers. Medical records from 20 years ago. A birth certificate for Brian Mitchell with Mum and Dad's names listed as parents. And beneath that, a DNA test result. I read it once, then, twice, then a third time, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. The tested individual, Brian Mitchell, is excluded as the biological child of the tested father, David Mitchell. Probability of paternity 0%. There were more documents. Legal papers granting custody of a minor child. A death certificate for someone named Lauren Carter. Mum's maiden name was Carter, her sister. I'd heard her mentioned maybe twice in my entire life, always in hushed tones, always with sadness and disapproval. I pulled out my phone and searched for Lauren Carter, adding Mum's hometown to the query. Obituaries came up. Lauren Carter, aged 24, died of a drug overdose, survived by her son Brian, aged 2, and sister Margaret Carter Mitchell. The pieces fell together with horrible clarity. Brian wasn't my parents' biological son. He was my cousin. Mum's sister had died of addiction when Brian was 2, and Mum and Dad had taken him in, not just taken him in, they'd legally adopted him, changed to his birth certificate, and never told him the truth. And Dad had kept DNA test results, proving Brian wasn't his biological son hidden in a false bottom drawer for 18 years. I sat on the floor of Dad's office documents spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, and everything about my childhood suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. Dad's distance from Brian wasn't favoritism or preference for me. It was the constant reminder that he was raising another man's child. Mum's desperate overcompensation wasn't just unconscious repetition of her own childhood. It was guilt and grief over her sister's death projected onto Brian. And Brian had no idea. He'd lived his entire life not knowing he was adopted, not knowing his real mother had died, not knowing that Dad's coldness came from resentment and Mum's smothering came from survivor's guilt. They'd built their entire family on a foundation of lies, and I was the only one who knew the truth. My hands trembled as I photographed every document. I didn't know what I was going to do with this information. Using it felt cruel, but not having it felt dangerous, especially now that Brian had shown he was capable of violence. I carefully reassembled the false drawer, but returned the envelope to its hiding place and put all the files back exactly as I'd found them. Then I left, locking the door behind me. As I drove away from that house, my house legally, though it had never felt like mine, I whispered to the empty car, "You've all been living a lie, and I'm the only one who sees it." I didn't know yet if seeing the truth would protect me or destroy me, but I knew I couldn't unsee it. And I knew that every decision I made from here on out would be made with the weight of this secret pressing down on me. The question was, what would I do with it? I spent that entire Saturday night staring at the photos on my phone. DNA test results, adoption papers, death certificate. Each document a piece of a puzzle that, once assembled, revealed a picture so different from the one I'd grown up believing that I felt like I was learning about a completely different family. I could destroy Brian with this information. One phone call, one conversation, and his entire identity would shatter. He'd learned that the parents who'd favoured him weren't even his biological parents, that his real mother had been an addict who died when he was too young to remember her, that Dad's distance wasn't complicated love but resentment at raising another man's child, that everything he thought he knew about himself was a carefully constructed lie. The temptation was real after what he had done to my apartment, after the threats and the violence, and the spray-painted hatred on my wall. Part of me wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt me, wanted to watch his world collapse the way mine had collapsed over a pair of $12 socks. But every time I imagined making that call, I heard Grandma's voice from the letter she'd left me. Don't let them make you feel guilty for having boundaries. And from deeper in my memory, something else she'd said at a family dinner years ago when someone had gossiped cruelly about a neighbour. Don't become cruel just because they were blind to your pain. That's how cycles continue. Grandma would not want me to weaponise this secret. She would want me to break the cycle, not perpetuate it with a different kind of cruelty. By Sunday morning, I'd made my decision. I would not tell Brian about his adoption. That was his parents' secret to reveal or keep, not mine. But I would protect myself legally, and I would let the natural consequences of my family's choices play out without my intervention. Monday morning, I called Dad a lawyer. The firm I chose was across town, far enough from my parents' neighbourhood that I wouldn't risk running into anyone who might know them. The attorney, Margaret Chen, was in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanour that I found immediately comforting. I'd brought everything: mortgage documents, bank statements, police report, photos of my vandalised apartment, screenshots of the threatening texts. She reviewed each document methodically, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she looked up at me over her reading glasses. "Ms. Mitchell, let me be very clear about your legal position. The house is 100% yours. You're the primary borrower. Your name is on the deed. Your parents are residents with certain rights, but they have no ownership claim whatsoever. If you choose to let the foreclosure process proceed, that's entirely your right. And they couldn't fight that claim I tricked them or coerced them. Did you trick them? No, I saved them from foreclosure 5 years ago. They knew I was refinancing. They signed the papers. They just didn't pay attention to what the papers meant. Margaret nodded. Then, no, they can't fight it. Willful ignorance isn't a legal defence. She tapped the police report. Now, regarding your brother's actions, this is criminal. Vandalism, breaking and entering, potentially stalking, given the pattern of following you and the threatening messages. With this police report, you have grounds to pursue charges. Will they actually prosecute? She hesitated, and I recognised that pause. I'd seen it in the police officer's face too. Family cases are complicated. Prosecutors often decline because victims tend to reconcile and drop charges. But given the severity, the break-in, the property damage, the threatening nature, you have a reasonable chance, especially if you're willing to follow through. What about a restraining order? That I can definitely help you with. We can file for a temporary order immediately, and there'll be a hearing in about 3 weeks for a permanent order. If granted, your brother won't be allowed within 500 feet of you, your home, or your workplace. I thought about Brian's face that night in the parking lot, about his hand on my arm, about the word traitor dripping down my wall. Let's do it. The restraining order and pursue charges for the vandalism. Margaret made notes. There's something else you should consider. Restraining orders are public record. When your brother is served, which will likely happen at his home or workplace, people will know. There may be questions, gossip. Are you prepared for that? The thought of Brian being served at work in front of his colleagues and his boss sent a complicated mix of emotions through me. Satisfaction, yes, but also sadness for what we'd become, for what we'd maybe always been but had never acknowledged. I'm prepared, I said. We spent another hour going over details, filling out forms, documenting everything. When I left her office 2 hours later, I had a plan. The restraining order would be filed today. The bank would continue its foreclosure process. The 90-day notice had already been sent, which meant my parents had until early April to come up with 60 days of back payments or lose occupancy rights. I wasn't going to intervene. I wasn't going to save them this time. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. This was the natural result of taking someone for granted for 37 years. Margaret walked me to the door. Ms. Mitchell, one more thing. You mentioned you work at a bank. First National, correct? Yes, I'm a senior loan officer there. You may want to put a fraud alert on all your accounts. Given your brother's behaviour and his apparent willingness to cross boundaries, identity theft is a real concern. You have access to information he might want, account numbers, credit cards, personal data. I felt a chill run down my spine. You think he'd steal from me? I think desperate people do desperate things. And based on what you've told me, your family is about to become very desperate. I left her office with that warning echoing in my head. I sat in my car in the parking garage and immediately opened my banking app, scanning for anything unusual. Everything looked normal. I changed all my passwords anyway, set up 2-factor authentication, and made a mental note to check my credit report. As I was about to start the car, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was my bank's fraud department. Suspicious activity detected on your account. Please call immediately. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stared at that email, Margaret's warning still fresh in my mind. I clicked through to my account, hands shaking, and saw it immediately. Someone had tried to open a business credit card in my name. The application had been flagged by the fraud detection system because the IP address didn't match my usual location, and the business name listed was completely unfamiliar, Mitchell Consulting Services, LLC. The credit line requested was $50,000. I felt sick. Margaret's warning had come one day too late. Brian had already tried to steal from me. I called the fraud department immediately. The representative, A woman named Diana, with a kind voice, walked me through the details. The application had been submitted yesterday from a coffee shop across town. It had been declined automatically due to the fraud flags, but the attempt was on record. Ms. Mitchell, do you know anyone who might have access to your personal information? Social security number, date of birth? Mother's maiden name? Yes, I said quietly. My brother. Another pause. Another recognition of complicated family dynamics. I see. We're going to need you to come in and file a formal fraud report. This could be attempted identity theft, which is a federal crime. Do you want to pursue charges? I thought about the spray paint on my wall, the smashed laptop, the threatening texts, the hand on my arm refusing to let me leave, and now this, attempting to steal $50,000 using my identity, my credit, my name. Brian wasn't just angry, he was dangerous. Yes, Jaguar Banaga, I said firmly. I want to pursue charges. For everything. I'll transfer you to our fraud investigation department. They'll coordinate with law enforcement. Ms. Mitchell, I'm very sorry you're going through this. As I waited on hold, I looked at my calendar. 3 weeks until the restraining order hearing. 6 weeks until the foreclosure deadline. And now, however long it took to investigate and prosecute identity theft, I'd thought standing my ground would be simple. Stop making payments, let consequences happen, maintain boundaries. But it wasn't simple at all. It was messy and complicated, and apparently escalating into criminal behaviour. But I couldn't back down now. Backing down would teach them nothing except that if they pushed hard enough, destroyed enough, threatened enough, I would crumble like I always had. It would teach Brian that violating my boundaries had no real consequences. It would teach my parents that my needs would always be subordinate to everyone else's comfort. And it would teach me that I was exactly what they'd always believed, someone whose pain mattered less than their convenience. The hold music ended. A male voice came on the line. Ms. Mitchell, this is Detective Ryan Morrison with the Fraud Investigation Unit. I understand you have information about an attempted identity theft. I took a deep breath and began explaining everything, the family conflict, the vandalism, Brian's escalating behaviour, and now this credit card application. Detective Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds of acknowledgement. When I finished, he said, Ma'am, I'm going to be honest. This case has a pattern I see too often. Family member with access to personal information, financial desperation, and escalating boundary violations. I want you to know we take this seriously, but I also want you to be safe. Do you have somewhere else you can stay for a while, someone who can be with you? The question made my isolation suddenly very real. Who did I have? My family had cut me off. My co-workers were friendly, but not close. I'd spent so many years being responsible, being available for my family's needs, that I'd never built a real support system of my own. I'll figure something out, I said, please do. And, Ms. Mitchell, document everything, every interaction, every attempt at contact, every threat. You're building a case here whether you realise it or not. The more evidence you have, the stronger your position. After the call ended, I sat in my car in that parking garage and felt the full weight of what I'd set in motion. This wasn't just about standing up for myself anymore. This was about survival. This was about protecting myself from people who were supposed to love me, but who had proven they valued their comfort more than my safety. My phone buzzed again. Another email, this time from the court system. Subject line, restraining order, filed, case number 2024 CV 847. It had begun. The legal machinery was in motion, and there was no going back now. I sat in that parking garage for another 10 minutes after the court email arrived, trying to gather the strength to do what came next. I had to go to my own workplace and formally report my brother for attempted fraud. I had to look my colleagues in the eye and admit that my family situation had deteriorated so badly that one of them was trying to steal my identity. The professional shame was almost worse than the personal pain. I drove to First National Bank and parked in the employee lot, watching people come and go through the glass doors. These were people I worked with every day, people who knew me as competent, reliable Sarah Mitchell, who never caused drama and always had her life together. What would they think when they learned the truth? But I couldn't let shame stop me. Shame was what had kept me silent for 37 years. I walked through those glass doors with my head up. The fraud investigation department was on the 3rd floor away from the customer-facing areas. I'd been up here before for work consultations, but never as a victim. The investigator assigned to my case was named James Patterson, a man in his early 40s with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen every variation of human dishonesty. He stood when I entered his office and shook my hand. "Ms. Mitchell, please sit down. I've reviewed the preliminary report from our fraud detection system. I'm very sorry you're dealing with this." "Thank you," I said, sitting in the chair across from his desk. "I work downstairs, in mortgage lending." "I know," he said gently. "That's actually part of why the fraud flags went up so quickly. Our system recognized your name and employment status, which made the credit card application particularly suspicious." He pulled up a screen on his computer and turned it toward me. "This is the application that was submitted yesterday at our Riverside branch location. You can see here it's requesting a $50,000 credit line for something called Mitchell Consulting Services, LLC. The social security number matches yours. The date of birth matches yours. But look at this signature." He zoomed in on the signature field. It was a reasonable approximation of my signature, but not quite right. The S in Sarah was too looped, the M in Mitchell too angular. Someone had practiced, but hadn't perfected it. "Our AI system caught it within 30 seconds, James continued. "Your real signature is on file from your employment documents and your own accounts with us. The algorithm detected a 73% similarity, which is high enough to be deliberate forgery, but not high enough to be genuine." "Do you know who submitted it?" James nodded slowly. "We pulled the security footage from the Riverside branch." He clicked a few buttons and video appeared on his screen. "Timestamp yesterday, 2:14 in the afternoon." The image showed the branch lobby from a ceiling-mounted camera. A man approached the counter, handed papers to a teller, waited while she processed them, then left when she asked him to return in 24 hours for a decision. The man was Brian. Even though I'd known it had to be him, seeing the proof felt like a physical blow. My brother, my actual blood relative, walking into a bank with forged documents bearing my name, trying to steal $50,000 from my credit. Not borrowing, not asking, stealing. "Do you know this person?" James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That's my brother, Brian Mitchell." James wrote something in his notes. "Had he asked you for money recently? Was there any discussion about loans or credit cards?" "No, we're not currently speaking. There's been..." I hesitated, unsure how much to share, but Detective Morrison had told me to document everything, and these people were going to find out anyway. "There's been a significant family conflict. My brother vandalized my apartment last week. I filed a police report and a restraining order. I think he's financially desperate because I stopped paying my parents' mortgage." James's expression didn't change, but I saw understanding flicker in his eyes. Another messy family situation. Another desperate relative. Another victim who'd probably feel guilty for prosecuting someone they loved. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to be very clear with you about what happens next. This isn't just fraud. This is identity theft and forgery, both of which are federal crimes. If we pursue this, and given that it's on video with clear documentation, your brother would likely face criminal charges. We're talking potential prison time, not just fines." "How much prison time?" "For this amount, and with the evidence we have, likely a plea deal for 18 months to 2 years if he cooperates, up to 5 years if he fights it and loses. 5 years. I thought about Brian at 7 years old, showing me his Pokemon cards. Brian at 16, asking me to help him with his math homework. Brian at 25, calling me crying after a bad breakup, because I was the only one who would listen without judgment. Somewhere underneath the angry, entitled man who'd spray-painted my wall and tried to steal my identity, that person still existed. But he'd made his choice, and I had to make mine. There's another option, James said carefully. We can close the case internally, mark it as resolved, and you could handle this privately as a family matter. Many victims choose that route, especially when the perpetrator is a relative. I looked at Brian's face, frozen on the security footage. Then I looked at my hands, saw the faint yellow remnants of the bruise where he'd grabbed my arm. I thought about my destroyed apartment, the laptop I'd had to replace, the sense of violation that came from knowing he'd been in my space, touching my things, destroying what mattered to me. I thought about Mum handing me those socks while Brian got a car, about 37 years of being invisible, about the mortgage payments I'd made while they planned to write me out of their will, about the cycle of pain that had started with Grandma and Mum and was now repeating with me and Brian. And I thought about Grandma's words. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people face the consequences of taking you for granted. This wasn't about kindness anymore. This was about survival. Prosecute, I said clearly. I want to pursue full prosecution. James studied my face, perhaps looking for hesitation or doubt. Miss Mitchell, I want you to be certain. Once we start this process, it becomes a criminal matter. The district attorney's office will take over. You can't just change your mind if your family pressures you. I'm certain. He's not just stealing money. He's stealing my identity, my peace, my life. That's not family, that's a criminal. And I'm done protecting criminals just because we share DNA. James nodded gravely and began typing on his computer. All right, I'm going to file the formal fraud report now and will forward all evidence to law enforcement. Given that Detective Morrison is already involved with your other case, I'll coordinate with him. The video footage, the forged application, the signature analysis, all of it will be submitted as evidence. What happens to Brian? He'll likely be arrested within 48 hours once the police have the evidence package. Given the severity and the clear evidence bail will probably be set, but it won't be low. We're talking $20,000 to $30,000. I thought about my parents' savings account, $800. They couldn't afford to bail him out. For the first time in his life, Brian would have to face consequences without a family safety net. Ms. Mitchell, James continued, I have to tell you this is federal fraud. Identity theft, forgery, attempted wire fraud. Your brother is looking at 2 to 5 years if convicted. And with this evidence, conviction is almost certain. Are you prepared for that outcome? I met his eyes. He broke into my home and destroyed my belongings. He's been threatening me. And now he's tried to steal my identity to commit fraud. What I'm not prepared for is letting him keep hurting me just because we're related. James nodded and extended his hand. I'll have the report filed within the hour. Someone from the DA's office will likely contact you in the next few days. In the meantime, I'd recommend what Detective Morrison probably already told you. Document everything, stay safe, and consider staying somewhere else until your brother is in custody. I shook his hand and left his office on unsteady legs. As I walked through the bank's hallway toward the elevator, I passed colleagues who smiled and waved. Normal Monday afternoon interactions. They had no idea that upstairs I'd just signed paperwork that would send my brother to prison. The elevator doors closed and I caught my reflection in the polished metal. I looked exactly the same as I had this morning. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I'd drawn a line in the sand, and I'd chosen my own safety over family loyalty. I felt no joy, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. I just felt empty, and oddly unexpectedly free. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. I stepped out into the lobby and walked toward my car, my phone already buzzing with a text from Detective Morrison. Received fraud report from First National. Moving forward with warrant. Will keep you updated. It was done. The machinery of justice was in motion, and my brother was about to discover that actions had consequences, even if those actions were against family, especially when those actions were against family. I went back to my desk on the second floor and tried to focus on work. There were loan applications to review clients to call back emails that had piled up during my meeting with James Patterson, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept circling back to Brian's face on that security footage, to the forged signature, to the reality that my brother would probably be arrested by Wednesday. I was staring blankly at a mortgage application when someone knocked on my cubicle wall. I looked up to find a man I'd seen around the office, but never really spoken to. He was maybe 40, with dark hair, starting to grey at the temples, and kind eyes that held something I recognised the weight of difficult experience. "Sarah Mitchell?" he asked. "Yes." "I'm Michael Torres. I work in the fraud resolution department upstairs. James Patterson asked me to follow up with you on some paperwork related to your case." He glanced around at the open office space at the colleagues within earshot. "Is there somewhere we could talk privately?" I led him to one of the small conference rooms we used for client meetings. The door closed behind us, muffling the ambient noise of the office, and suddenly the day felt very quiet and very heavy. Michael set a folder on the table, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at me with that same gentle directness James had shown. "I want to start by saying, I'm sorry this is someone you know. Family fraud dialers they're the hardest ones to process. Not legally, they're straightforward, but emotionally, they're brutal." "Thank you," I said, surprised by how much his acknowledgement meant. Most people either avoided the topic entirely or looked at me with barely concealed judgment, as if I must have done something to deserve being victimised by my own family. "I've reviewed your case file," Michael continued. "James was thorough. The evidence is solid. But I wanted to check in with you personally, because these cases have a high rate of victims backing out once the reality of prosecution hits. I need to know if you're committed to following through, or if you need more time to think about it." I thought about my destroyed apartment, about the threats about the $50,000 fraud attempt. "I'm committed. I'm not changing my mind." Michael nodded, and something in his expression shifted respect, maybe, or recognition. "Good. That's good. Because once your brother is arrested, the pressure from your family is going to intensify. They'll call you cruel. They'll say you're tearing the family apart. They'll make you feel like you're the villain in this story." He paused. "Don't let them." There was conviction in his voice that went beyond professional advice. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am." Michael sat down and gestured for me to do the same. "My older brother stole $30,000 from me 5 years ago. He had access to my financial information because we jointly inherited some money when our father died. He took his half and then forged documents to take mine too. Gambled it all away within 6 months. I sat down across from him, drawn into his story, despite, or maybe because of my own exhaustion. "What did you do?" "At first, nothing. My mother was sick, and everyone said I needed to be the bigger person. They said family forgives, they said he was struggling, and I should have been watching out for him. Somehow his theft became my failure to prevent it." Michael's jaw tightened at the memory. "It wasn't until Mom passed away and he tried to steal from her estate too that I finally pressed charges. By then, it was almost too late. He'd learned that I'd always back down and he'd gotten bolder because of it." "Did he go to jail?" 18 months. He served 14 with good behaviour." Michael met my eyes. "And you know what? That was the best thing that ever happened to our relationship. Not because I wanted him to suffer, I didn't. But because for the first time in his life, he had to face consequences without me swooping in to fix everything. Prison forced him to get sober, get therapy, and actually confront what he had done. When he got out, he apologized. Really apologized. Not the "I'm sorry you're upset" kind, but the "I understand what I took from you and I'm working to become someone who'd never do that again" kind. Are you two in contact now? We are. Carefully, with boundaries. He knows I love him, but he also knows I'll never let him hurt me again. And weirdly, that's made our relationship healthier than it ever was when I was protecting him from himself. Michael opened the folder and pulled out some papers. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something crucial. Helping them won't teach them. Only consequences do, but consequences don't mean you stop loving them. They mean you love yourself enough to stop the bleeding. I felt tears prick my eyes. Everyone else has made me feel like a monster for this. That's because everyone else hasn't been where you are. They haven't had to choose between being destroyed by family or saving themselves from family. It's easy to judge from the outside. He slid one of the papers towards me. Now I need to show you something else. When James asked me to process your case, I did a comprehensive review of all financial connections between you and your family members. Standard procedure for fraud cases, we look for patterns of exploitation. My stomach tightened. And you found something. I found a home equity line of credit taken out 5 years ago on the property at 428 Maple Street. That's your parents' address, correct? The one you refinanced. Yes, but there shouldn't be any equity loan. I refinanced the entire mortgage. Everything went through me. Michael pulled out another document and set it in front of me. It was a loan application from 5 years ago, dated 3 months after I'd completed the refinance. A home equity loan for $30,000. My eyes scanned the paperwork looking for the borrower information and stopped cold when I reached the signature line. My name, Sarah Mitchell, in handwriting that looked like mine but wasn't quite right. The same way Brian's forgery hadn't been quite right on the credit card application. Your father took out this loan using your identity as the primary borrower, Michael said quietly. He did it shortly after the refinance went through, probably assuming the equity was there to access. The bank approved it because you'd just been approved for the primary mortgage, your credit was excellent, your income was verified. They had no reason to suspect fraud. I stared at that signature at my father's crime, written in ink on official bank documents. How much has been paid back? According to the records, the monthly payments have been made from your parents' joint checking account. But, Sarah, those payments are small, about $250 a month, mostly interest. The principal has barely been touched. After 5 years, there's still $28,000 outstanding on this loan. And because it's a home equity line of credit against the property you now own, it's technically your debt. My blood ran cold. I'm responsible for a loan I didn't take out. Technically, yes, the loan is secured against the property, but practically this is forgery and fraud. Your father committed identity theft when he forged your signature. You're the victim here, not the borrower. Michael leaned forward. This is separate from your brother's case. This is your father committing a federal crime 5 years ago. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. You could prosecute this too. I felt the room tilt slightly. Brian trying to steal $50,000 was one thing, he was desperate, angry, lashing out. But Dad had done this 5 years ago calmly and deliberately, while I was helping them save their home. While I was signing papers to take on their mortgage to protect them from foreclosure, he was behind the scenes forging my signature to extract more money. Do my parents know you found this? No, this came up in the fraud investigation. They don't know we're looking at their financial history. Michael hesitated. Sarah, I have to ask, did you have any knowledge of this loan? Did your father ever mention it? Never. I had no idea. I thought back to 5 years ago, to the refinance process, to the months after. Had there been new purchases? Home improvements? Where had $30,000 gone? What did he use the money for? The loan application states home repairs and medical expenses, but I can't verify that. The money went into their checking account and then it's hard to trace after that. Groceries, utilities, cash withdrawals. It dissolved into general expenses. I sat back in my chair trying to process this new betrayal. So for 5 years, while I've been paying $2,000 a month for their mortgage, they've also been paying $250 a month for a loan Dad took out in my name, a loan that's technically my responsibility. That's correct. And if the house goes into foreclosure, I'm still on the hook for this $28,000 debt. Unless you prosecute the fraud and get the loan invalidated, which you can do. The evidence is clear forged signature identity theft fraud. It's actually an easier case than your brother's because we have the application with the forged signature compared against known samples of your real signature. It's textbook forgery. I looked at Michael, this man I'd barely known an hour ago, who was now showing me the full scope of my family's betrayal. If I prosecute this, my father goes to prison too. Probably. The sentencing might be lighter than your brother's, because there's no violent component and the debt has been serviced. But yes, he'd likely face prison time. I thought about Dad sitting at that dining room table, with his jaw clenched, telling me I was no longer part of the family if I didn't make the mortgage payment. I thought about him watching me pay $2,000 a month for 5 years, while knowing he'd stolen $30,000 from me. I thought about the ultimatum, the coldness, the complete absence of acknowledgement for everything I'd sacrificed. And I thought about the adoption papers hidden in his desk drawer, the DNA test proving Brian wasn't his biological son, the death certificate for Mum's sister, all the secrets this family had built itself on, and me, the only one who'd stumbled onto the truth. I need to think about this, I said finally. Brian's arrest is going to happen in the next 48 hours. If I add Dad to that, if they're both facing charges at the same time, your mother will be alone, Michael finished, and she'll blame you for destroying the family. She already blames me. But, yes, it'll get worse. Michael gathered the papers and put them back in the folder. Take your time. This statute of limitations doesn't expire for another few months. You don't have to decide today. But Sarah, whether you prosecute or not, you need to know the truth your father stole from you. Premeditated, calculated theft. That's not a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. That's a crime. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. I meant what I said earlier. The pressure from your family is going to get worse before it gets better. If you need someone who understands what this is like, someone who won't judge you for protecting yourself, call me. Not as a bank colleague, as someone who's been in your shoes and knows how much they hurt. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. That's my cell. Use it if you need it. After he left, I sat alone in that conference room for a long time, holding the business card in one hand and staring at the folder on the table. Inside that folder was proof that both my brother and my father had committed federal crimes against me. Identity theft, forgery, fraud. My entire family had been stealing from me while I paid their bills and smiled through their favoritism and absorbed their dismissal like it was what I deserved. Michael's words echoed in my head. You love yourself enough to stop the bleeding. The bleeding had been going on for 37 years. Maybe it was time to finally apply a tourniquet, even if it meant cutting off the source. I left work early that day. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency, which was technically true, and drove to my parents' house with the loan documents in a folder on my passenger seat. Every red light felt like the universe giving me a chance to turn around to let this go, to pretend I'd never seen that forged signature. But I kept driving. It was 3:30 when I pulled into their driveway. Dad's truck was there, which meant he was home. I timed it deliberately after lunch before dinner, when Mum would likely be out running errands. I wanted this conversation to be with him alone first, before Mum's emotions complicated everything. I rang the doorbell instead of using my key. That small boundary felt important. When Dad opened the door, his face registered surprise, then wariness. We hadn't spoken since the dinner where he told me I was no longer part of the family. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk. Can I come in?" He hesitated, clearly weighing whether to refuse, but years of ingrained hospitality won out. He stepped aside. I walked past him into the living room where I'd spent countless childhood hours, where I'd opened those $12 socks just 6 weeks ago and started this entire cascade. I set the folder on the coffee table between us. "I found something today. Something I need you to explain." Dad looked at the folder like it might contain a live snake. "What is it?" I opened it and pulled out the home equity loan application with the forged signature. I placed it on the table, the signature line facing him. "This is a loan application from 5 years ago for $30,000. That's my name at the bottom, except I didn't sign it." The colour drained from Dad's face. He sat down heavily on the couch, his eyes fixed on the document, but not really seeing it. His mouth opened again. "I can explain. You forged my name." I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "You committed identity theft. That's a felony, Dad. A federal crime. So yes, please explain." He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father as he truly was, not the strong, silent authority figure of my childhood, but a weak man who'd built his life on lies and borrowed money. "I was desperate. You have to understand, I was desperate. Desperate for what I'd just refinanced the house for you. I'd saved you from foreclosure. What did you need $30,000 for?" The silence stretched so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Gambling debts." Of all the answers, I'd imagined that one hadn't made the list. "Gambling? You told me you quit gambling after your heart attack." "I did quit. But before that, before I got sick, I had debts. Serious debts. People were calling the house, showing up at my work. I was terrified they'd come after your mother or..." He trailed off, unable to finish. Or what, or me, or Brian. I sat down across from him, needing to be at eye level for this conversation. "So you stole from me instead. You forged my signature and took $30,000 while I was working overtime to pay your mortgage." "I thought I could pay it back," he said weakly. "The monthly payments were small. I thought I'd get back on my feet and pay it off before you ever knew it existed. But then I kept not getting better, and the money kept being tight, and the years kept passing." "5 years," I said flatly. "For 5 years, you let me pay $2,000 a month on the mortgage while you paid $250 a month on a loan you took in my name. That's $153,000 I've given this family. And how much of that was spent on your gambling debts?" Dad put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry. God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. Sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't undo forgery. Sorry doesn't give me back 5 years of payments on a debt I didn't create." I leaned forward. "Did Mum know? Does she know you forged my signature?" "No. She knows about the loan, but not about how I got it approved. She thinks you co-signed it." A key turned in the front door. We both froze. Mum's voice called out, "David, whose car is in the driveway." She appeared in the living room doorway, grocery bags in her hands, and stopped when she saw me. "Sarah, I didn't expect... What's going on?" I looked at Dad, giving him a chance to tell her himself. But he just sat there silent and small, so I picked up the loan document and handed it to my mother. "Mum, did you know Dad forged my signature to take out a $30,000 loan 5 years ago?" Mum's face went confused, then disbelieving. She looked at the document, at Dad, back at the document. "What? No. This is... You co-signed this? David said you co-signed it." "I didn't. That's not my signature. That's a forgery. Dad committed identity theft." Mum's grocery bags hit the floor. Eggs cracked. Neither of us moved to clean them up. "David, tell me she's wrong. Tell me you didn't. Dad's silence was answer enough. You forged our daughter's name. Mum's voice rose, trembling with shock and fury. She was saving our house, and you were stealing from her. You let me believe she'd agreed to help with this loan, and all this time she didn't even know it existed. Margaret, please, I can explain. Explain what? That you're a thief, that you stole from our daughter while she paid our bills, that you let me thank her for co-signing a loan she never agreed to. Mum sank into a chair, her face flushed. All these years I thought Sarah was just being generous. I thought she'd chosen to help. But you forced her, didn't you? You forged her name and made her responsible for your debts without her consent. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, David? Mum's eyes were blazing now, years of suppressed knowledge breaking through. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been lying to both of us for 5 years, and Sarah's been paying for your lies. Dad finally looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since Mum arrived. I let both my children down. I know that, Brian, with too much enabling you, with too much expectation, but only one of you was strong enough to carry me. So I leaned on you, and I leaned too hard. The admission hung in the air. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even remorse. It was just a statement of fact delivered with the exhaustion of a man who'd finally stopped running from the truth. You didn't lean on me, I said quietly. You stole from me, and you let me believe I was being a good daughter while you committed crimes in my name. Mum was crying, now silent tears streaming down her face as she stared at her husband of 40 years, like she was seeing him for the first time. What else don't I know? What else have you lied about? I thought about the adoption papers hidden in Dad's desk, the DNA test, Brian's true parentage, but that secret wasn't mine to tell, not in this moment. This moment was about the crime Dad had committed against me. I stood up, picking up the loan document. I'm leaving now, but you both need to know Brian is going to be arrested within 48 hours for attempting to steal my identity and commit fraud. And now, I have evidence that you did the same thing, Dad. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to prosecute you too, but I want you to understand that I could. I have every legal right to put you in prison. Dad's face crumpled. Mum let out a small broken sound. And I stood in the doorway of my childhood home watching my parents' marriage crack in real time, watching the facade of our family finally shatter completely. I should have felt vindicated, victorious, satisfied that the truth was finally out. Instead, I just felt tired. Bone, deep, soul tired. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from Detective Morrison. We have a warrant for Brian Mitchell's arrest. Expect execution within 48 hours. I looked at my parents one last time. Brian's going to need you. I suggest you figure out which one of you still has the moral authority to help him. Then I walked out, leaving them in the ruins of everything they'd built on lies and theft and favoritism. The cold air hit my face as I reached my car. I sat behind the wheel, hands shaking, and realized I'd just burned down my entire family structure in less than 24 hours, and somehow I still felt more free than I'd felt in 37 years. I woke up Wednesday morning knowing today would be the day. Detective Morrison had said 48 hours, and it had been exactly that. I got ready for work slowly, methodically checking my phone every few minutes, even though I knew the police wouldn't notify me when they arrested Brian. That's not how it worked. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when my phone rang. 7:15 in the morning. Mum's number. I stared at it, my finger hovering over the decline button. But something made me answer. Maybe I needed to hear it. Maybe I needed to know it was real. Sarah. Mum's voice was barely recognizable, high and thin and shaking. They're here. The police are here. They're putting Brian in handcuffs. Sarah, please, you have to stop this. Please. I heard voices in the background, official tones. Sir, please step back. Ma'am, you need to calm down. The sounds of my family's world collapsing in real time. Mum, I can't stop it. It's out of my hands now. The district attorney's office. You're lying. You could drop the charges if you wanted to. You're doing this to punish us. Her voice broke into sobs. They're taking my baby. They're taking my baby, and you're letting them. Through the phone, I heard the mechanical click of handcuffs. Heard the officer reading Miranda rights in that flat practice tone. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Sarah, please. That was Brian's voice, now distant but clear. Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Just tell them it was a mistake. I closed my eyes and saw his face on the security footage, submitting forged documents with my name, saw my destroyed apartment, saw the spray-painted hatred on my wall. It wasn't a mistake, Brian. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. You bitch, he spat, his voice suddenly vicious. You self-righteous. The phone cut off. Either Mum had hung up or they'd taken Brian away. Either way, the silence that followed felt louder than the shouting. I set my coffee down with shaking hands. I didn't go to work. I called in sick and spent the morning sitting on my couch waiting for something more calls, more news, more fallout. It didn't take long. By 8:30, I had 6 missed calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Aunt Carol, who'd missed my college graduation, but made it to all of Brian's birthday parties. Uncle Tom, who'd once told me I should stop being so serious when I was working 3 jobs to pay tuition. Cousin Jennifer, who I hadn't heard from since she asked me to loan her $2,000 and never paid it back. The texts started around 9. Most of them weren't supportive. From Aunt Carol, I can't believe you do this to your own brother. Your mother is devastated. You should be ashamed. From Uncle Tom, family is supposed to forgive. You've crossed a line, Sarah. But then surprisingly from Cousin Rachel, whom I'd always liked, I heard what happened. Good for you. Someone needed to stop enabling him. Let me know if you need anything. At noon, my phone lit up with a news alert. Local man arrested for identity theft and fraud victim was his own sister. The article was short, didn't name me specifically, but anyone who knew our family would recognise the details. Brian Mitchell, 32, arrested for attempting to open a fraudulent credit card account using his sister's personal information. Previous incidents of domestic vandalism being investigated. Bail set at $25,000. $25,000. My parents had $800 in savings. Brian would sit in jail unless someone could post bail, and there was no one left to ask except me, and I wasn't going to. At 2:00, my phone rang again. Mum calling from a number I didn't recognise. Probably a neighbour's phone since I'd been sending her calls to voicemail. I answered. Mum. Sarah, please. She was calmer now, but her voice was hollow, scraped raw from crying. Please drop the charges. He's your brother. Family forgives. Family helps each other through mistakes. This wasn't a mistake. I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. A mistake is forgetting to call on my birthday. This was premeditated fraud. He forged my signature. He tried to steal $50,000 from my credit, after destroying my apartment and threatening me. He was desperate. We were desperate. You stopped paying the mortgage and we didn't know what to do. So you decided identity theft was the answer. Mum, listen to yourself. You're justifying a federal crime because I set a boundary. It's not just a boundary, Sarah. It's your brother's life. He'll have a criminal record. He could go to prison. He'll lose everything. He should have thought about that before he committed a crime. I took a breath. Mum, I've forgiven Brian 100 times. I've forgiven you and Dad 1,000 times. I forgave you when you gave him a car and me socks. I forgave you when you never noticed the $143,000 I gave this family. I forgave Dad when he forged my signature on a loan. I'm done forgiving people who never change. So you're going to destroy this family instead. No, Mum. You destroyed this family when you taught Brian his needs mattered more than mine. When you let him grow up thinking he could take whatever he wanted without consequences. When you built a family on favoritism and lies, and I stopped myself before I said adoption secrets. That wasn't my truth to tell. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just finally refusing to be destroyed. She hung up without saying goodbye. By evening, the story had made its way through our entire extended family network. My phone was a constant buzz of notifications, texts, calls, emails, social media messages from people I'd forgotten existed. The opinions were split roughly down the middle. Half the family thought I was a vindictive monster. The other half quietly messaged their support, some sharing their own stories of being exploited by family members and never having the courage to fight back. At 6 o'clock, I got a text from a number I recognized Jessica, Brian's girlfriend, soon-to-be ex-girlfriend apparently. I'm sorry for what he did to you. I didn't know. I should have seen it. Engagement is off. I hope you're okay. Short, clinical final. The car Mum and Dad had bought to impress her was now just another symbol of wasted favoritism. I was making dinner something simple pasta with vegetables when my email alert chimed. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another relative weighing in on my moral failures. But the subject line caught my attention, regarding your parents' estate. The sender was Henderson & Associates, estate attorneys. My stomach dropped. I set down my knife and opened the email with trembling fingers. Dear Ms. Mitchell, we represent David and Margaret Mitchell in estate planning matters. We're writing to inform you of recent changes to their last will and testament executed on February 14, 2024. As a party previously named in their estate documents, we're required to notify you of your removal from said documents. All assets, including real property, financial accounts, and personal effects, have been designated to Brian Mitchell as sole beneficiary. If you have questions regarding this change, please contact our office. I read it twice, 3 times. They'd written me out of their will. Not just reduced my share, eliminated me entirely. And they'd done it on Valentine's Day, a month and a half after Christmas, when I was still paying their mortgage and hadn't yet discovered any of the fraud. They'd planned to cut me out before any of this exploded. Before the confrontation, before the arrest, before I'd stood up for myself. They'd decided I was disposable while I was still playing the role of family saviour. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The absurdity was too much. They'd left everything to Brian, including a house he had no legal claim to because I was the actual owner. They'd written a will distributing assets they didn't own, cutting out the daughter who'd financed their survival in favour of the son who was now sitting in county jail for fraud. The whole thing would be funny if it weren't so devastatingly sad. I forwarded the email to Michael Torres. Not because I needed professional advice. I knew the will was meaningless since I legally owned the house. But because he'd told me to call if I needed someone who understood, and right now I needed someone to confirm that I wasn't crazy for feeling both heartbroken and vindicated at the same time. My phone rang 5 minutes later. Michael's voice was warm but serious. Sarah, I got your email. I'm so sorry. They wrote me out before any of this happened, I said, my voice flat. They were planning to disinherit me while I was still paying their bills. That tells you everything you need to know, Michael said gently. This wasn't about you stopping payments or pressing charges. This was about who they'd always valued more. You're just finally seeing what was always true. He was right, and somehow that made it hurt less and more at the same time. Can you come over? I asked Michael, surprised by how much I needed someone physically present. I know it's late, but I don't want to be alone with this right now. Give me 30 minutes, he said without hesitation. He arrived in 25 holding 2 coffees and a folder I recognised from his office. We sat at my kitchen table, the email from Henderson & Associates pulled up on my laptop between us. "Read me the whole thing," Michael said. "I want to hear it in their words." I pulled up the attached PDF, the formal notification letter, and read aloud. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, we represent David and Margaret Mitchell in estate planning matters. We're writing to inform you of recent changes to their last will and testament, executed on October 18th, 2024. I stopped. Wait, October 18th? That's 2 months before Christmas. Michael finished quietly. They made this decision in the fall when you were still paying their mortgage without question. I kept reading, my voice mechanical. All assets, including real property at 428 Maple Street financial accounts, life insurance policies and personal effects have been designated to Brian Mitchell as sole beneficiary. Sarah Mitchell has been explicitly removed from all estate documents. The stated reasoning is, our daughter is financially independent and doesn't require our assistance, while our son needs continued support to establish himself. I set the laptop down and stared at Michael. They wrote me out of their will while I was actively supporting them. They gave me socks for Christmas knowing they'd already cut me out of everything. This wasn't a reaction to me stopping payments. This was planned months in advance. Michael nodded grimly. This will was written before you set any boundaries, before you stopped paying, before you stood up for yourself. Which means their favoritism, their belief that Brian deserves everything and you deserve nothing that wasn't caused by your actions. That's just who they've always been. I felt something crack open inside me. Not my heart breaking that had already broken. This was different. This was the final death of a hope I hadn't even known I was still carrying, the hope that if I'd just been better, more accommodating, more generous, they would have loved me equally. They were never going to see me, I whispered. Nothing I did would have changed it. No, Michael agreed gently. It wouldn't have. And Sarah, there's something else you need to know. He opened the folder he'd brought and pulled out a document. This is a draft of that will. It was created by Henderson & Associates, yes, but the specific attorney who wrote it was... He slid the paper toward me. At the bottom, in the attorney signature line, prepared by Thomas Henderson, senior partner, and handwritten in the margin, a note in different ink. Per client request, exclude daughter Sarah, son Brian, sole beneficiary, Th. Thomas Henderson, I repeated. Should that name mean something to me? Michael's jaw tightened. Thomas Henderson is my father. The room tilted slightly. I looked at Michael, at the document, back at Michael. Your father wrote the will that disinherited me. He did. I didn't know about your family specifically until I was assigned your fraud case. But I knew what my father's firm did. I'd seen it before, families coming in, usually with one successful child and one who needed help. The successful one gets cut out because they don't need it. The struggling one gets everything because the parents want to give them one last chance. You knew this was happening to people like me. I suspected, but I didn't know for sure until about a year ago. Michael ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of deep frustration. I was still working at my father's firm then. He'd asked me to review some estate files, make sure everything was properly documented. Your parents' file was in the stack. You saw my name? I saw everything. The original will from 10 years ago that split everything 50-50 between you and Brian. And then the new will dated October, cutting you out entirely. I saw the notes my father had written. Daughter is financially stable, doesn't need inheritance. Son requires continued support. It was dated the same month as your refinance documents, which were in the same file because of the property transfer. I felt sick. Your father knew I owned the house. He knew I'd taken on their mortgage, and he still helped them write a will leaving that house to Brian. He did. And when I confronted him about it, when I asked how he could ethically help parents disinherit a daughter who was actively supporting them, Michael's voice went hard. He said, "The law allows parents to distribute their estate however they choose. Our job isn't to judge their decisions, it's to document them. Sometimes parents know what's best for their children better than the children know themselves." He said that while looking at documents proving I'd saved their house. He said that. And that's when I knew I couldn't work there anymore. I couldn't work for a man who thought it was acceptable, ethical, even to help parents systematically exploit their own children and then cut them out of any future benefit. Michael met my eyes. I quit the firm the next day. My father hasn't spoken to me since. He thinks I'm being self-righteous and throwing away a partnership over sentimental nonsense. I stared at him, understanding blooming. "That's why you helped me. Not just because you understood family exploitation, but because you had literally seen my case. You knew what they'd done." "I didn't know it was you specifically when James assigned me your fraud case. Your employee file had your maiden name Mitchell, but it didn't click until I saw the property address, 428 Maple Street. Then I pulled up your parents' estate file from my old records and..." He shook his head. "There you were. The daughter who'd refinanced her parents' house, who'd taken on their debt and who'd been repaid by being written out of their will 3 months later. How is that even legal? How can they leave Brian a house they don't own? Technically, they can write whatever they want in a will. It just won't hold up in probate. When they die, the executor, probably Brian since he's named primary beneficiary, will discover the house isn't actually an estate asset because you're the legal owner. The will would be meaningless for the primary asset they think they're leaving him." I laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "So they wrote a fantasy will. They're distributing assets they don't have to a son who's sitting in jail for fraud, while excluding the daughter who actually owns what they think they're giving away." "That's exactly what they did." Michael hesitated. "Sarah, I have to tell you something else. When I saw that will, when I realised what my father had helped your parents do, I made copies. I wasn't supposed to, it violated firm confidentiality policies. But I knew that will was morally wrong, even if it was technically legal. I kept copies in case you ever needed them. You've had evidence of my disinheritance for a year before I even knew it existed." "I have. I didn't know if I'd ever use them. I didn't know if I'd ever even meet you. But when your fraud case landed on my desk, when I realised you were the woman my father had helped disinherit, I knew I had to make sure you understood what you were dealing with. Not just Brian's fraud, not just your father's forgery, but the systematic devaluation of your worth by everyone in your family, documented and formalised by my own father's legal practice." I felt the room spin. This man I'd barely known 2 weeks ago had been carrying knowledge of my family's betrayal for a year, had quit his job over the principle of it, had kept evidence that could protect me, even when he didn't know if we'd ever meet. "Your father wrote the will that cut me out," I said slowly, "and you quit working for him because of it." Michael nodded, and I saw shame in his eyes, not for himself but for his father's actions. When I confronted him, when I told him it was wrong to help parents exploit their children like that, he said, "Sometimes parents know best." He actually believed he was helping your parents make a wise decision. That's when I knew I couldn't be his son anymore, not the way he wanted me to be. Not if being his son meant accepting that some children deserve to be valued less than others. We sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd been devalued by their families, who'd had to choose between being loved and being respected, and who'd both chosen respect even though it cost them everything. "How do we fix this?" I finally whispered. Michael reached across the table and took my hand. "We let the law do what it's supposed to do. The will is meaningless because the assets aren't theirs to distribute. Your father's forgery is documented. Brian's fraud is prosecuted. And when the dust settles, you're left with legal ownership of a house that's rightfully yours, free from the debt they tried to saddle you with, and free from the obligation to people who prove that they never valued you anyway. That's simple. The law is simple. The emotions are brutal. But yes, legally it's that simple. He squeezed my hand. Sarah, you're going to be okay. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. And I'll be here to help you get there. I looked at our hands joined across a table covered in evidence of betrayal and realised I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The next morning, Michael arranged a meeting with an independent attorney, someone who had no connection to his father's firm, no history with my family, no conflict of interest. Her name was Patricia Reeves, and she specialised in family law and estate disputes. We met in her downtown office, a clean modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Patricia was in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Michael had sent her all the documents in advance: the will, the refinance papers, the forged home equity loan, the foreclosure, notice everything. She'd had time to review it all before we arrived. Miss Mitchell, she began, folding her hands on her desk. I've reviewed your case thoroughly. Let me be very direct with you about your legal position. The will your parents created is meaningless. They cannot bequeath property they don't own. You are the legal owner of the house at 428 Maple Street. The deed is in your name. The mortgage is in your name. Their will is, legally speaking, a fantasy document. I felt a strange sense of vindication hearing it stated so plainly. So Brian can't claim the house. No. When your parents pass away, whenever that may be, the house will not be part of their probate estate because it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to you. Brian would have no legal claim to it whatsoever, regardless of what the will says. What about the savings accounts and life insurance they mentioned? Patricia checked her notes. According to the financial records Michael provided, their joint savings account currently contains $823. Life insurance policies total $50,000, with Brian named as sole beneficiary. That part of the will would stand since they own those policies. But the house, which is presumably the most valuable asset they believe they're leaving, isn't theirs to give. And the forged loan my father took out, the $30,000. That's fraud and identity theft. You have clear grounds to prosecute. The signature analysis Michael's fraud team did shows definitive forgery. If you choose to pursue criminal charges against your father, he'd likely face similar consequences to your brother: federal fraud charges, possible prison time. I thought about Dad sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, admitting to gambling debts. About Mum's face when she learned he'd forged my name. I haven't decided about that yet. You have time. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. Patricia pulled up another document. Now, regarding the foreclosure timeline, the bank issued a 90-day notice after you stopped making payments in January. We're now in mid-May, which means that deadline is July 5th. Your parents need to pay $6,000, 3 months of back payments, or vacate the property. Do they know that deadline? The bank sent multiple notices. They know. And they have $800 in savings. I did the math. They can't possibly come up with $6,000. Not without a miracle or outside help. Patricia leaned back in her chair. Which brings me to your brother's situation. He's currently in county jail, bail set, at $25,000. That would require a 10% cash bond, $2,500, which your parents also don't have. His public defender has already reached out to the DA about a plea deal. Well, what kind of plea deal? If he accepts responsibility and pleads guilty to identity theft and attempted fraud, the DA will recommend 18 months with possibility of parole after 12. If he fights it and loses at trial, he's looking at 3 to 5 years. 18 months. A year and a half of Brian's life, all because he tried to steal from me instead of getting a job and earning money honestly. Patricia watched my face carefully. Ms. Mitchell, I need to ask you a difficult question. What do you want out of this situation? You have all the power here. You own the house. Your parents can't stay without your permission. Your brother is facing prosecution you initiated. Your father committed fraud you could prosecute. You control every lever. So what do you actually want? I sat quietly for a long time, staring out those floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. People going about their lives unaware that, in this office, one woman was deciding the fate of her entire family. What did I want? I thought about Grandma's letters, both of them. The one to me saying, don't let them make you feel guilty for having boundaries. And the one to Mum saying, break the cycle I couldn't. I thought about the socks, about 37 years of being invisible, about the car with the red bow and the wheel dated October 18th. I want them to learn, I said finally. Not to suffer, to learn. There's a difference. Patricia nodded slowly. What does that learning look like to you? I want them to understand what they took from me. Not just money, though that's part of it. But the assumption that I didn't matter as much as Brian. The belief that my needs were optional while his were essential. I want them to feel what it's like to need someone and not have them there, because that's how I felt my entire life. And after they've learned what to them. I didn't have an answer to that yet. Patricia stood and walked to her window, gesturing for me to join her. Ms. Mitchell, I've been practicing family law for 30 years. I've seen situations like yours more times than I can count. And I can tell you this, justice and mercy aren't opposites. Sometimes mercy is only meaningful after justice has been served. Your family won't value your forgiveness until they understand what it cost you to give it. We wrapped up the meeting with the plan, let the foreclosure timeline continue. Don't pay the back mortgage. Let the bank follow through with eviction proceedings if it comes to that. Monitor Brian's plea deal negotiations. And, most importantly, document everything. As Michael and I walked to the parking garage afterward, he asked the question Patricia had left hanging. So what will you do? I looked up at the sky, thinking of Grandma who told me to let people face consequences, thinking of the socks she'd made for Mum and the ones Mum had given to me, thinking of 37 years of being the strong one, the capable one, the one who could handle it. I'm going to do something they never did for me, I said. I'm going to tell them the truth, all of it. I'm going to sit them down and explain exactly how much I've sacrificed, exactly how much they've taken, exactly how deeply they've failed me. No softening it, no protecting their feelings, just the complete, unvarnished truth. And after that, I met Michael's eyes. Then I'll decide if mercy is deserved, because mercy without truth is just enabling, and I'm done enabling. He walked me to my car, and before I got in, he said quietly, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing this exactly right. It takes real strength to hold people accountable when it would be easier to just forgive and forget." "I don't want to forget," I said. "Forgetting is what let this cycle continue for 3 generations. I want them to remember. I want them to carry this the way I've carried 37 years of being second best." I drove home thinking about July 5th, less than 2 months away. 2 months until my parents would either pay what they owed or lose their home. 2 months to decide if I wanted to stop that from happening. 2 months to figure out what justice looked like when the people who owed it were the ones who'd raised you. July 5th came and went. My parents didn't pay. I knew they wouldn't, couldn't, but part of me had wondered if they'd find a way. Maybe sell Dad's truck. Maybe borrow from relatives. Maybe something. They did nothing. 5 days later, I sat in a courtroom watching a judge review documents I'd spent months assembling. The mortgage showing my name as primary borrower. The refinance agreement from 5 years ago. The bank's 90-day foreclosure notice. The certified mail receipts proving my parents had received every warning. My parents sat on the other side of the room with a court-appointed advocate. They couldn't afford a real lawyer. Mum's face was grey. Dad stared at his hands. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewed the final document and looked up. The property at 428 Maple Street legally belongs to Ms. Sarah Mitchell. She is the primary borrower and deed holder. The current occupants, Mr. and Mrs. David Mitchell, are residents without ownership claim. She removed her glasses. Given the documented non-payment and expired foreclosure timeline, current occupants must vacate the property within 30 days, August 10th. Mum made a sound like she'd been hit. Dad's shoulders slumped. 30 days, 1 month to pack up a lifetime and leave. I didn't go to the house on eviction day. I couldn't. Michael went in my stead, making sure the sheriff's presence kept everything peaceful. He texted me updates throughout the morning. They're packing boxes. Moving truck arrived. Your mom is crying but cooperating. They're leaving now. By 4 o'clock it was done. My parents had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment across town, $900 a month, the cheapest they could find. Dad's truck was gone sold to cover the deposit. At 6 o'clock, I drove to 428 Maple Street, the house where I'd grown up, the house I'd saved 5 years ago, the house that was now legally and finally mine alone. I unlocked the front door with the key I'd never stopped carrying and stepped inside. The silence was overwhelming. No television murmuring in the living room. No coffee smell from the kitchen. Just empty rooms and dust motes floating in the evening light. I walked through slowly cataloguing memories. The kitchen where I'd cooked Christmas dinner while everyone else waited. The dining room where I'd received $12 socks. The living room where Dad had told me I was no longer family. My childhood bedroom still painted the same pale blue from 20 years ago. I sat down on the floor of that bedroom back against the wall where my bed used to be and cried. Not gentle tears, harsh body-shaking sobs for the little girl who had grown up in this room believing she wasn't enough. For the woman who'd paid $143,000 trying to earn love that should have been free. The doorbell rang just as the sun was setting. I wiped my face and went downstairs, assuming it was Michael checking on me. It was Mum. She stood on the porch holding a small suitcase. Her clothes rumpled, her hair uncombed. Rain had started falling and she was soaked through. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Breakable. Sarah. Her voice cracked. Can we stay here just for a little while? The apartment... She stopped, swallowed. Please. Every cell in my body screamed to slam the door, to let her stand in the rain, to make her feel the rejection I'd felt for 37 years. But then I heard it, Grandma's voice, clear as day. Break the cycle, child. Break it. I stepped aside. Come in. We need to talk. Mum stood dripping on the hardwood floor of the entryway, clutching her suitcase like a life preserver. I gestured toward the living room. Sit down. I'll make coffee. I needed those few minutes in the kitchen to steady myself, to remember why I'd opened the door instead of slamming it. Breaking cycles meant doing something different, not something easier. I made 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the living room, where Mum sat perched on the edge of the couch, looking like a guest in a house she'd lived in for 30 years. I sat across from her in Dad's old recliner and said the words I'd been rehearsing for weeks. You can stay here temporarily, 90 days, but there are conditions. Anything, Mum said immediately. Sarah, anything. First condition, complete honesty. Starting now. I want the whole truth about everything, the favoritism, the will, the loans, all of it. No more excuses or justifications. Just truth. Mum's hand shook around her coffee mug. For the next 4 hours we talked. She called Dad, put him on speaker, and together they confessed things I'd suspected but never confirmed. Dad's gambling addiction that started 20 years ago, 10 years sober now, but the debt still haunting him. The forged loan taken in desperation and shame. Mum admitted what I'd seen in her own mother's note, that she knew she favoured Brian, had always known but convinced herself it was balancing Dad's emotional distance from him. Then Mum said something that made everything finally make sense. I was terrified Brian would leave us if he ever found out he wasn't really ours. I thought if I gave him enough, loved him enough, made him feel essential enough, he'd never discover the truth and never leave. And you, her voice broke, you were always so strong, so capable. I thought you didn't need me the way he did. I set down my coffee cup carefully. I needed you, Mom. Every single day of my life I needed you, but you never looked. Mum broke, then really broke, tears streaming down her face. I see that now. God help me, I see it now. Seeing it isn't enough, I said, my voice gentle but firm. You have to change it. I pulled out a printed document I'd prepared weeks ago, hoping I'd have the chance to use it. These are the rules. You and Dad can stay here for 90 days while you get back on your feet. You'll pay rent $200 a month, whatever you can actually afford. You'll attend family therapy with me every week. Dad will attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings. You'll contribute to household chores. And if either of you breaks these rules, you're out immediately. No second chances. I slid the paper across the coffee table. Do we have a deal? Mum picked up the paper with shaking hands, reading through tear-blurred eyes. She pulled out her phone and called Dad back. I heard his voice small and defeated through the speaker as she read him the terms. A long silence. Then Dad's whisper. Tell her yes. Tell her we'll do whatever it takes. Mum looked at me, and for the first time in my 37 years, I saw her really see me. Not the capable daughter who could handle anything, not the backup plan or the safety net, but me, a person with needs and limits and value. Deal, she whispered. I want you to come with me somewhere, Michael said over coffee one Saturday morning in mid-September. We'd been seeing each other regularly, carefully, slowly, both of us aware that we'd met during crisis and needed to build something real beyond trauma bonding. Where? A support group I attend for adult children of difficult families, people who have been exploited, neglected, or made invisible by the people who should have protected them. He hesitated. I think it might help you to hear other stories, to know you're not alone in this. I'd been hesitant at first. My parents were living in my house following my rules. Brian was serving his plea bargain sentence. The major battles felt over. But Michael was right. I was still processing everything, still waking up some mornings unsure if I'd done the right thing or destroyed my family for nothing. The support group met in a church basement on Thursday evenings. 12 people sat in a circle of folding chairs ranging in age from late 20s to mid-60s. The facilitator, a therapist named Dr. Chen, welcomed me warmly and invited me to share if I felt comfortable. I listened first, Linda, 52, whose 3 siblings had conspired to steal their mother's estate, leaving her with nothing despite being the primary caregiver for years. Marcus, 44, whose parents had emptied his college fund to bail out his brother's failed restaurant, then blamed Marcus for being selfish when he couldn't help them retire. Yuki, 38, whose extended family expected her to fund everyone's emergencies while openly mocking her corporate job as selling out. Each story was different in details, but identical in shape. One person designated as the family's resource, another designated as the one who needed resources, and a system that punished boundaries while rewarding exploitation. When it was my turn, I told them everything. The socks and the car, the $143,000, the forged signatures, both Brian's and Dad's, the arrest, the disinheritance, the eviction, and finally, the conditional mercy I'd offered when Mom showed up in the rain. The room was silent when I finished. Then Marcus leaned forward, his voice shaking. You're my hero. I've been paying my family's bills for 15 years and I'm drowning, but I can't stop because I don't know what happens if I do. How did you find the courage to stop I thought about that question carefully. I didn't find courage. I found my limit. And once you know where your limit is, you can't unknow it. The question isn't whether to stop. The question is what you do when you reach that breaking point. After the session ended, 3 people approached me asking for my contact information. A young woman named Rachel, maybe 30, pulled me aside, her hands shaking. My parents are about to lose their house. They want me to co-sign a new mortgage. I'm their retirement plan, their safety net, their everything. I don't know how to say no without destroying them. I looked at her terrified face and saw myself 8 months ago standing at that same crossroads. I took her hand. Let me tell you how I learned. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, forwarded through my parents. The return address showed the county correctional facility. Brian's name in the upper left corner, his handwriting on the envelope slightly shakier than I remembered, but unmistakably his. I stood in my kitchen holding it, my first instinct to throw it away unopened. I didn't owe him my attention. He'd destroyed my apartment, threatened me, tried to steal my identity. Why should I care what he had to say now? But Michael's voice echoed in my head from a conversation weeks ago. You don't have to forgive him, but maybe you need to hear him. Not for his sake, for yours. I opened it. The letter was 6 pages handwritten on lined paper. Brian's words were careful measured nothing like the angry brother who'd grabbed my arm and followed me home. He wrote about being 16 years old, coming home early from a friend's house, hearing Dad and Mum arguing in their bedroom. Dad's voice loud and bitter. He's not even my son. Why do I have to pretend? Brian had stood frozen in the hallway, his entire identity shattering in that single sentence. I realised that night that I wasn't really yours, he wrote. That I was someone else's kid, someone Mum and Dad took in, and I became terrified that if I wasn't good enough, perfect enough, needed enough, they'd send me back to where I didn't know. I just knew I had to make myself indispensable. He wrote about watching how they treated me capable, independent, taken for granted, and being terrified of becoming that. I saw that you could survive being invisible and I couldn't. So I let them make me the favourite. I let them give me things while you got nothing. I told myself you didn't need it. You were strong enough, you'd be fine. But the truth is, I was just scared. And I'm so sorry, Sarah. God, I'm so sorry. The letter's ending hit me hardest. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking if you can help me understand. How did you survive being invisible? Because now, sitting in here with no car, no girlfriend, no family, showing up for visits, finally, invisible myself, I don't know who I am. I read it 3 times, tears streaming down my face. I thought of the socks and the car and 37 years of being second best. Then I thought of Brian at 16, overhearing that he wasn't wanted, spending his whole life trying to earn a place that should have been his by right. We'd both been victims of the same broken system. We'd just played different roles. I picked up a pen and paper and began to write, Dear Brian, being invisible doesn't mean you don't exist. It means they weren't looking. Now we both know what that feels like. Maybe that's where we start. The email from Jessica came with a subject line that made my stomach tighten. We need to talk about your family's story. I stared at it for 2 days before responding. Jessica had disappeared completely after texting me that the engagement was off. I'd assumed she'd moved on with her life, wanted nothing to do with the Mitchell family chaos. But now she wanted to meet. Curiosity won out over caution. I agreed to coffee at a neutral cafe downtown. Jessica looked different than I remembered. No perfect makeup, no designer clothes, just jeans, a sweater, and nervous energy. She ordered tea she didn't drink and spent 5 minutes rearranging sugar packets before finally meeting my eyes. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. She took a breath. I need to tell you something and you're going to be angry, but I'm hoping you'll hear me out before you leave. I waited. I'm not who Brian thought I was. I mean, my name is Jessica, that part's real, but I'm not just some girlfriend he met at a bar. I'm a psychology PhD student at the university. My dissertation is on golden child and scapegoat dynamics in families. She paused. I write an anonymous blog called The Invisible Daughters Project. It's about toxic family systems and the children who survive them. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. You're a researcher. You were studying my family. Not initially. When I met Brian 8 months ago, I genuinely didn't know about your family's dynamics. But then he invited me to Christmas, and I watched your mother give him a car while you got socks. I watched her say, your brother needs it more. I watched your face, the way you smiled and said you understood while your eyes went dead. And I knew I was witnessing the most extreme case of favoritism I'd ever seen. So you stayed with Brian to document us like we were lab rats. I started to stand. Please, let me finish. Jessica's voice cracked. Yes, I stayed. Yes, I documented what I saw. And yes, I knew that was ethically questionable. But, Sarah, I run a blog where thousands of women write to me saying they think they're crazy for feeling hurt that their families treat them like backup plans. Women who've given everything and received nothing. Women who believe they're selfish for wanting to matter. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through emails, her hand shaking. Read this one. I'm paying my parents' bills while my brother parties and buys new cars. They say I'm bitter and ungrateful when I ask for help. Am I the bad guy? Or this, my sister got a house down payment as a wedding gift. I got a toaster. My parents say she needed help and I don't. I feel like I'm losing my mind. What would you tell her? Jessica asked, looking up at me. What would you tell that woman who's drowning and thinks she's selfish for wanting air? I closed my eyes. What would I say? I opened my eyes and looked at Jessica. I'd tell her she's not the bad guy. I'd tell her that family obligation isn't supposed to be one-directional. I'd tell her to find her limit before it destroys her. I paused. I'd tell her what I wish someone had told me 10 years ago. Jessica nodded slowly. That's why I'm here. I want to publish your story, fully anonymized, names changed, but your story. Because right now, thousands of women are where you were last Christmas, and they need to know they're not crazy. They need permission to save themselves. You used my family's pain without asking. I did, and I'm asking now, retroactively, imperfectly, but I'm asking. Will you let me share what I witnessed? Will you help me turn your survival into something that helps others survive too? I took the draft article home and spent 3 days thinking. I talked to Michael, who said, it's your story, only you can decide if sharing it publicly is worth the exposure. I talked to my therapist, who reminded me that vulnerability could be empowering or re-traumatizing depending on how it was handled. I even talked to my parents. Mum surprised me. If it helps one person avoid what we put you through, then something good comes from our mistakes. Maybe that's how we honor what you survived. The draft Jessica had written was painful but fair. She'd captured the Christmas scene, the favoritism, my years of financial support, and my decision to stop. She'd changed names and identifying details, but anyone who knew us would recognize the story. I called Jessica with my conditions. I'll agree, but with terms, all names changed, no identifying details. Proceeds split 50-50, half to me, half to a fund we'll create for adult children escaping financial abuse. And you donate your PhD research honorarium to the same fund. If you're profiting from my pain, so are the people who need help. Jessica agreed without hesitation. The article published on November the 1st with a title that made my breath catch, The Daughter Who Paid the Mortgage for the Family That Gave Her Socks. Within 48 hours, it had been shared 500,000 times. Major outlets picked it up. My anonymous story was suddenly everywhere on morning shows, in think pieces, in heated family dinner debates across the country. My inbox became a tsunami. Over 10,000 messages in the first week. Women aged 25 to 65 writing to say, "This is my life. I thought I was alone. I thought something was wrong with me. Thank you for showing me I'm not crazy." But there were critics too. Family is family. You're cruel and vindictive. Your parents raised you, and this is how you repay them. Young people today have no sense of obligation. I read them all, the praise and the condemnation, and realised something: the people who criticised me were often the ones benefiting from similar dynamics in their own families. They needed to believe I was wrong, because admitting I was right meant examining their own exploitation of others. One email stood out from the thousands. The subject line, "I'm the mother in your story." My hand shook as I opened it. "Dear Sarah, I don't know if you'll read this. I'm a 58-year-old mother who just realised I've been doing to my daughter exactly what was done to you. I have 2 children, a son I've coddled and enabled, and a daughter I've taken for granted because she's so capable. I've been asking her for money while giving him gifts. I've been expecting her to sacrifice while excusing his selfishness." Your story broke me open. I called my daughter crying and apologised. She didn't believe me at first. She thought I wanted something. "Can you tell me, is it too late to fix it? Or did I destroy my relationship with her the way your parents almost destroyed theirs with you?" I stared at that email for a long time, tears streaming down my face. This was why Jessica's research mattered. This was why sharing my pain publicly, despite the vulnerability and criticism, was worth it. One mother was waking up. And if one mother could wake up, maybe others could too. I hit reply and began to type. 2 weeks after the article went viral, Mum asked if we could talk privately, not at the dinner table with Dad present, not during our weekly therapy sessions, but just the 2 of us. She asked me to sit in the living room, my living room in the house that was now mine, and she held a notebook with shaking hands. "I read the article," she began, her voice thin. "I know the names were changed, but I recognised every word, every scene, every moment of pain we caused you." She looked up, her eyes red. "And I need you to know you were right about everything." I stayed silent, letting her continue. "I've been working with Dr. Chen on understanding why I did what I did. Not to excuse it, but to make sure I never do it again." She opened her notebook, and I saw pages of handwritten notes, scratched out and rewritten evidence of hours of difficult self-examination. "I made a list of everything I did wrong and why." She read from her notes, her voice breaking. "I gave you socks because I convinced myself you didn't need material things. You were so self-sufficient, so capable that I told myself you wouldn't care. But the truth is, I was afraid to give you more because then I'd have to admit I'd been giving Brian too much. I gave him a car because I was terrified he'd leave us if I didn't prove our love was worth staying for. I made you invisible because acknowledging you meant seeing my own mother in me, and I couldn't face that." Mum closed the notebook, tears streaming down her face. "None of that is an excuse. It's just an explanation, and I'm done making excuses." She pulled out another document, 12 pages stapled together, her therapy homework. "Dr. Chen calls these repair actions, concrete things I'm doing differently." She showed me the list. "Tell Sarah I love her, not for what she does, but because she exists. Notice when Sarah needs help and offer it without being asked. Stop comparing Brian and Sarah. Acknowledge my favoritism out loud instead of pretending it didn't happen. Ask about Sarah's life instead of only talking about problems." I read through the pages, seeing weeks of genuine effort, documented in my mother's careful handwriting. Small actions that added up to a complete reversal of 37 years of patterns. "There's something else," Mum said quietly. She left the room and returned with Dad, who was holding a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you a letter," Dad said, his voice gruff with emotion. My therapist assigned it, but I need to read it to you, not just hand it over. He unfolded the paper, his hands trembling, and began reading. Dear Sarah, I taught you that your value was in what you could give. I taught Brian that his value was in what he could take. I taught us all that love was transactional, that affection had to be earned through usefulness or need. I taught you that being strong meant being alone, and I taught him that being weak meant being taken care of. I was wrong about all of it. His voice broke. I'm sorry. I'm learning now, at 72 years old, that love is presence. It's showing up not because someone can do something for you, but because they matter. I'm trying to be present now. I know it's late, but I'm trying. He folded the letter and handed it to me. When I took it, I saw his eyes were full of tears. I sat there motionless, holding my father's letter while my parents waited for me to respond. For 37 years, I'd wanted this moment to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, not for what I provided, but for who I was. I'd imagined it would feel triumphant, vindicated, healing. Instead, I felt overwhelmed. The child in me wanted to forgive immediately, to take this apology and pretend the past didn't matter. But the adult I'd become through pain knew that apologies were just words until they were backed by sustained action. That evening, I called Michael. They apologised, really apologised, with specifics and action plans and therapy homework. I should feel relieved, so why do I feel so confused? Michael was quiet for a moment. Do you forgive them? I don't know. Is that what I'm supposed to do now? That's not the question, he said gently. The question is, can you live with them in the truth? Because you can't go back to the lies. You can't pretend the past didn't happen just because they've apologized. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's deciding whether you can build something new on the ruins of what broke. I looked at Dad's letter in my hand, at Mum's 12 pages of repair actions sitting on my coffee table. They were trying, really trying. But trying wasn't the same as healing, and healing wasn't the same as restoration. I don't know if I can go back to being their daughter, I whispered. Maybe you're not supposed to, Michael replied. Maybe you're supposed to become something new. Michael's words stayed with me. Maybe you're supposed to become something new. I realized he wasn't just talking about my relationship with my parents. He was talking about me, about who I was becoming through this entire painful transformation. I couldn't respond to 10,000 emails individually. Each one deserved attention, validation, and practical help. But I was still just one person with a full-time job and my own healing to do. What I needed was something structural, something that could help people long after my own story faded from public attention. That's when I created Grandma's Gift Fund. I named it after Grandma Ruth, who'd first planted the seed that eventually grew into my ability to set boundaries. The fund's mission was simple: provide practical support for adult children trying to escape financial abuse from their families. Not therapy alone, not just advice, but concrete resources that made escape possible. Working with Jessica and a lawyer Michael connected me with, we established the nonprofit structure. The fund would provide $500 legal consultation grants for people needing help understanding their rights, therapy subsidies for those who couldn't afford treatment, emergency housing deposits for people who needed to move out immediately, and financial literacy courses teaching people how to set and maintain boundaries around money. The article's proceeds became the seed funding. Jessica donated her research honorarium as promised. And then donations started pouring in, $5 here, $50 there, from people who saw themselves in my story and wanted to help others escape. On December the 1st, we awarded our first 50 grants. Linda, from my support group, was one of them. At 52, she finally had enough money for a security deposit on her own apartment, away from the siblings who'd stolen her inheritance and the parents who'd enabled it. She sent me a photo of her empty living room with a message, First time in my life I've lived alone. First time I've felt free. Rachel, the woman from the support group who'd been pressured to co-sign a mortgage, used her grant for legal consultation. She learned she could say no without guilt, learned that her parents' financial crisis wasn't her responsibility to fix. She called me crying not from sadness, but from relief. Then something unexpected happened. I received a letter from Brian, forwarded through my parents. He'd been in prison for 7 months now, writing to me regularly, our correspondence slowly rebuilding something that might eventually resemble a sibling relationship. Sarah, the letter read, I know the will that left everything to me is legally meaningless since you own the house, but I want to formally legally give up any claim I ever had to anything in that will. I want you to use whatever rights I have symbolic as they are for the fund. I can't undo what I took from you. I can't give back the 37 years you spent being invisible. But maybe I can help give to others what I should have given you all along, support. I sat with that letter for a long time, crying in a way that felt different from before. Not bitter tears or angry tears, but something softer, grief for what we'd lost, yes, but also hope for what we might still build. A week later, the local news station contacted me about covering Grandma's gift fund. I almost said no, I'd had enough public exposure, but they convinced me it would help spread awareness and bring in more donations. The reporter was a woman in her 40s who admitted before the interview that she'd read the article and cried. My sister is the golden child, she said quietly. I've been the responsible one my whole life. Your story helped me see it wasn't just in my head. During the filmed interview, she asked, what do you want people to learn from your story? I thought about the socks and the car, about the mortgage payments and the forged loans, about the arrest and the eviction and the painful, slow rebuilding, about Mum's 12 pages of repair actions and Dad's tear-stained letter, about Brian learning in prison what invisibility felt like, about the 10,000 women who'd written to say, me too. I smiled a real smile this time, not the one I'd worn for 37 years while pretending everything was fine. I want them to learn that being kind to yourself isn't selfish, it's survival, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for them, is to say no. The interview aired that evening. By morning, Grandma's gift fund had received $15,000 in new donations. I was becoming something new indeed. The invitation came on December 15th, 3 weeks after the news interview aired. Mum approached me tentatively after our weekly therapy session, her hands twisting together in that nervous way she'd developed since moving into my house. Sarah, would you come to Christmas dinner this year, here at the house? You don't have to decide right now, and if you say no, we understand, but we'd like to try again, differently this time. I didn't answer immediately. Last Christmas had been the catalyst for everything, the socks, the car, the mortgage payment I didn't make, the entire cascade of consequences that had brought us here. The thought of sitting at that same table, opening presents in that same living room, felt both impossible and necessary. I need time to think about it, I said. Of course, take all the time you need. 3 days later, Mum called with a question that made my breath catch. Sarah, we're planning the menu. Dad and I realised we don't actually know your favourite foods. We've been cooking the same Christmas dinner for 30 years, turkey and stuffing and green bean casserole, but we never asked what you liked. So we're asking now. What would you want? I sat down, overwhelmed by the simplicity and profundity of the question. Roasted butternut squash soup. It was Grandma Ruth's recipe. She used to make it for me when I visited her. I remember that soup, Mum said quietly. She made it for me too when I was young, before everything got complicated. A pause. We'll make it. Together, you can show me how she taught you. December 20th brought news I hadn't expected. Brian was being released early for good behaviour. 8 months served, 10 months of probation ahead. He was moving into a halfway house and had already secured a job as a warehouse clerk. Hard work, honest work, nothing glamorous. He called me that evening, his voice tentative. Sarah, I'm not asking to come to Christmas. I know that would be too much. I just wanted you to know that I'm out, I'm working, and I'm trying, really trying. I'm glad, I said, and meant it. Keep trying, Brian. That's all any of us can do. Are you going to Mum and Dad's for Christmas? I don't know yet. Whatever you decide, it's the right decision. You've earned the right to choose what's best for you. He paused. That's something I learned in there. You don't owe people access to you just because they're family. You get to decide. That conversation stayed with me as I sat with Michael 2 nights before Christmas. We'd been dating for 2 months, slowly, carefully, both of us, aware that we'd met during crisis and needed to build something real beyond shared trauma. But it was working. He understood me in ways no one else could. Last Christmas broke me, I said, curled up on his couch with tea, warming my hands. This Christmas, I don't know what it'll do. Michael pulled me closer. Maybe it doesn't have to break or fix you. Maybe it can just be a day, a meal with people who've hurt you and are trying to do better, not a redemption arc or a final chapter, just a day. Just a day, I repeated, testing the words. I think I can handle that. December 24th arrived cold and clear. At 6 o'clock, I stood on the porch of 428 Maple Street. My house legally, my parents' home emotionally. A space complicated by ownership and memory, and slow, painful healing. I was holding 2 things. In my left hand, the wool socks from last Christmas, washed and folded. In my right hand, a gift bag containing a framed photo of Grandma Ruth and a Christmas card. I'd written and rewritten the message inside 5 times, never quite capturing what I wanted to say. Finally, I'd settled on the truth. To Mum and Dad, thank you for trying. It doesn't erase the past, but it's building something new. Love, Sarah. I took a breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, and rang the doorbell. This time I didn't use my key. This time I waited to be invited in. This time everything was different. The door opened and Mum stood there with flour dusting her apron, her face lighting up in a way I'd never seen before, pure, uncomplicated joy at seeing me. You came, she whispered, her eyes already glistening. Oh, Sarah, you came. I came, I said simply, and she stepped aside to let Michael and me in. The house smelled different this year. Not just the traditional turkey scent, but something else, butternut squash soup, Grandma's recipe that Mum and I had made together 2 days ago. That smell alone told me this Christmas would be nothing like the last. Dinner was at 7 and it was small. Just the 4 of us, me, Mum, Dad and Michael. Brian had called yesterday and told me he wouldn't be coming. I need to earn my seat to wait at that table, he'd said, not just show up because it's Christmas. Maybe next year if you'll have me. I told him maybe next year, and I'd meant it. We sat down to eat, and for the first time in my memory, I wasn't the one who'd done all the cooking. For the first time, I wasn't serving everyone while my own plate sat empty. We passed dishes around the table, each of us serving each other, and that simple act of mutual care said more than any apology could. Dad said grace, his voice catching. Thank you for this food, for this home that Sarah has given us, and for the chance to do better. Amen. The meal was quiet but comfortable. We talked about simple things, the weather, Michael's job, how the fund was doing. No one mentioned last Christmas. We didn't need to. It was there in the space between us, acknowledged and accepted. After we'd finished eating, Mom disappeared into the other room and returned with a small wrapped box. She placed it in front of me, her hands trembling slightly. We wanted to give you something meaningful this year, she said. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was an old-fashioned savings passbook with handwritten entries. The balance showed $2,000 accumulated over the past 4 months in small deposits, $20 here, $50 there. Dad cleared his throat. It's not enough. It'll never be enough to repay the $143,000 you gave us or the 37 years you spent being invisible. But it's the start of paying you back, not just the money, but acknowledgement. Every deposit is us saying we see what you did. We see what it cost you. My vision blurred as I ran my finger over each entry dated and recorded, like promises kept. "Thank you," I whispered. I reached into my gift bag and pulled out the framed photo of Grandma Ruth holding baby me, and beneath it, the card. Mum opened it and read aloud, her voice breaking. "To the family I chose to keep, not because you were perfect, but because you finally chose to see me." She pressed the card to her chest and wept. Dad put his arm around her, not to stop her tears, but to sit with her in them. Then Dad stood, his water glass shaking in his hand. "I want to make a toast," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To Sarah, who taught us that love isn't sacrifice, it's respect. Who showed us that strength isn't silence, it's boundaries. Who gave us something we never gave her a second chance." He looked directly at me. "We don't deserve you, but we're going to spend whatever time we have left trying to." We raised our glasses. Michael squeezed my hand. Mum openly cried, and I felt something inside me settle. Not forgiveness that erased the past, but acceptance of a complicated present. Peace with loving people who'd failed me and were genuinely trying to change. We drank together, all of us crying, and I thought of Grandma Ruth, who'd started this with a pair of socks and a note about breaking cycles. I hoped she could see this. I hoped she knew. 1 week later, I stood in my own apartment, the one I'd moved back to once my parents were stable. I needed my own space, even as they continued living in the house under our agreement. I was decorating for the new year when I pulled Dad out those wool socks from last Christmas. I hung them on my fireplace mantel right in the centre, where I could see them every day. Michael came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Grandma would be proud," I said softly. I broke the cycle. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with an email. Subject line: "Grandma's gift fund your year-end impact report." I opened it and read aloud to Michael. 200 families helped, 500 people in therapy, 50 people housed, 12 lawsuits won, 1,000 boundaries set. Countless lives changed. I smiled, set my phone down, and looked at those socks hanging on my mantel. Last Christmas, they'd been a symbol of everything I'd never be to my family. This Christmas, they were a reminder of everything I'd become. Not through revenge, not through destruction, but through the hard, painful work of breaking a cycle 3 generations old and building something better in its place. As snow fell outside my window, I leaned back against Michael and felt it fully, that elusive thing I'd been chasing all year. Peace. Not justice, though consequences had been served. Not revenge, though boundaries had been enforced. Not even complete reconciliation, though healing had begun. Just peace with myself, with my choices, with the truth that you could love people and still protect yourself from them. This Christmas, I finally got what I needed, and peace, I realised, was the greatest gift of all. Sarah's story didn't end with that second Christmas. It continues every day in the choices she makes, the boundaries she holds, and the lives she touches through Grandma's gift fund. Her parents are still learning, still attending therapy, still making those small deposits into that savings account. Brian is rebuilding his life, one honest day at a time, earning back trust he once took for granted. And Sarah, she's learning that healing isn't linear, that forgiveness is complicated, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. But here's the truth that Sarah discovered and wants every forgotten daughter, every invisible child, every family scapegoat to know. You are not selfish for having limits. You are not cruel for enforcing boundaries. You are not a bad person for protecting yourself from people who should have protected you. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop enabling and start requiring accountability. If Sarah's story resonated with you, if you've ever been the responsible one, the capable one, the one expected to sacrifice while others receive, please know you're not alone. There are thousands of us who've walked this path, who've had to choose between being loved and being respected, and who've learnt that real love includes both. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in Sarah's position? Are you the family's safety net, the one everyone leans on, but no one thinks to support? Or maybe you're a parent watching this and recognizing yourself in Sarah's mother, realizing you've been taking one child for granted. Whatever your story is, share it in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story helped you see your own situation more clearly, if it gave you permission to consider setting boundaries you've been afraid to set, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, we share stories about people who found the courage to choose themselves, who learned that self-respect isn't selfish, and who discovered that sometimes the family you build is stronger than the family you're born into. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been paying their family's bills while receiving nothing but expectations in return. Someone who got socks while their sibling got a car. Someone who's drowning and needs permission to save themselves. Remember Sarah's final lesson. Being kind to yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. Thank you for listening to Sarah's journey. Thank you for being here. And if you're currently standing where Sarah stood last Christmas, wondering if you have the right to stop catching everyone else while you fall, let me tell you what Grandma Ruth would say. You have that right. You've always had that right. Now give yourself permission to use it. Subscribe, comment, and remember that your story matters. See you in the next video.